Preface and Chapter 1 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Preface. Conceive him now in a man of war, with letters of mart, well armed, victualled, and appointed, and see how he acquits himself. Thomas Fuller's Good Sea Captain. Note: in the year 1843, I shipped as ordinary seaman on board of a United States frigate, then lying in a harbor of the Pacific Ocean. After remaining in this frigate for more than a year, I was discharged from the service upon the vessel's arrival home. My man-of-war experiences and observations have been incorporated in the present volume. New York, March, 1850. Chapter 1. The Jacket. It was not a very white jacket, but white enough, in all conscience, as the sequel will show. The way I came by it was this. When our frigate lay in Callao, on the coast of Peru, her last harbor in the Pacific, I found myself without a grego, or sailor's surtout, and as, toward the end of a 3 years' cruise, no pea-jackets could be had from the purser's steward, and being bound for Cape Horn, some sort of a substitute was indispensable. I employed myself for several days in manufacturing an outlandish garment of my own devising, to shelter me from the boisterous weather we were so soon to encounter. It was nothing more than a white duck frock, or rather shirt, which, laying on deck, I folded double at the bosom, and by then making a continuation of the slit there, opened it lengthwise, much as you would cut a leaf in the last new novel. The gash being made, a metamorphosis took place, transcending any related by Ovid, for presto, the shirt was a coat. A strange-looking coat, to be sure, of a Quakerish amplitude about the skirts, with an infirm, tumble-down collar, and a clumsy fullness about the wristbands, and white, yea, white as a shroud. And my shroud it afterward came very near proving, as he who reads further will find. But bless me, my friend, what sort of a summer jacket is this, in which to weather Cape Horn? A very tasty and beautiful white linen garment it may have seemed, but then people almost universally sport their linen next to their skin. Very true, and that thought very early occurred to me, for no idea had I of scudding round Cape Horn in my shirt, for that would have been almost scudding under bare poles indeed. So, with many odds and ends of patches, old socks, old trouser legs, and the like, I bedarned and bequilted the inside of my jacket till it became all over stiff and padded as King James's cotton-stuffed and dagger-proof doublet, and no buckram or steel hauberk stood up more stoutly. So far very good, but pray tell me, White Jacket, how do you propose keeping out the rain and the wet in this quilted grego of yours? You don't call this wad of old patches a mackintosh, do you? You don't pretend to say that worsted is waterproof? No, my dear friend, and that was the deuce of it. Waterproof it was not, no more than a sponge. Indeed, with such recklessness had I bequilted my jacket, that in a rainstorm I became a universal absorber, swabbing bone dry the very bulwarks I leaned against. Of a damp day my heartless shipmates even used to stand up against me, so powerful was the capillary attraction between this luckless jacket of mine and all drops of moisture. I dripped like a turkey a-roasting, and long after the rainstorms were over, and the sun showed his face, I still stalked a Scotch mist, And when it was fair weather with others, alas, it was foul weather with me. Me? Ah, me. Soaked and heavy, what a burden was that jacket to carry about, especially when I was sent up aloft, dragging myself up, step by step, as if I were weighing the anchor. Small time, then, to strip and wring it out in a rain, when no hanging back or delay was permitted. No, no, up you go, fat or lean, Lambert or Edson, never mind how much avoirdupois you might weigh, and thus, in my own proper person, did many showers of rain reascend toward the skies, in accordance with the natural laws. But here be it known that I had been terribly disappointed in carrying out my original plan concerning this jacket. It had been my intention to make it thoroughly impervious by giving it a coating of paint, but bitter fate ever overtakes us unfortunates. So much paint had been stolen by the sailors in daubing their overhaul trousers and tarpaulins that by the time I, an honest man, had completed my quiltings, the paint pots were banned and put under strict lock and key. Said old Brush, the captain of the paint room, "Look ye, White Jacket," said he, "ye can't have any paint." Such then was my jacket, a well-patched, padded, and porous one, and, in a dark night, gleaming white as the White Lady of Avenel. End of Preface and Chapter 1. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 2 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 2. Homeward Bound. All hands up anchor! Man the capstan! High die, my lads, we're homeward bound! Homeward bound. Harmonious sound. Were you ever homeward bound? No? Quick, take the wings of the morning, or the sails of a ship, and fly to the uttermost parts of the earth. There tarry a year or two, and then let the gruffest of boatswains, his lungs all goose-skin, shout forth those magical words, and you'll swear the harp of Orpheus were not more enchanting. All was ready, boats hoisted in, stunsail gear rove, messenger passed, capstan bars in their places, accommodation ladder below, and in glorious spirits we sat down to dinner. In the ward-room the lieutenants were passing round their oldest port, and pledging their friends. In the steerage the middies were busy raising loans to liquidate the demands of their laundress, or else, in the Navy phrase, preparing to pay their creditors with a flying foretopsail. On the poop the captain was looking to windward, and in his grand, inaccessible cabin the high and mighty Commodore sat silent and stately as the statue of Jupiter in Dodona. We were all arrayed in our best and our bravest. Like strips of blue sky lay the pure blue collars of our frocks upon our shoulders, and our pumps were so springy and playful that we danced up and down as we dined. It was on the gun-deck that our dinners were spread, all along between the guns, and there, as we cross-legged sat, you would have thought 100 farm-yards and meadows were nigh. Such a cackling of ducks, chickens, and ganders, such a lowing of oxen and bleating of lambkins, penned up here and there along the deck to provide sea repasts for the officers. More rural than naval were the sounds continually reminding each mother's son of the old paternal homestead in the green old clime, the old arching elms, the hill where we gambled, and down by the barley banks of the stream where we bathed. "All hands up anchor!" When that order was given, how we sprang to the bars, heaved round that capstan, every man a Goliath, every tendon a hawser, round and round, round, round it spun, like a sphere, keeping time with our feet to the time of the fifer, till the cable was straight up and down, and the ship with her nose in the water. "Heave and pawl! Unship your bars, and make sail!" It was done. Barmen, nippermen, tierers, veerers, idlers, and all, scrambled up the ladder to the braces and halyards, while, like monkeys in palm trees, the sail-loosers ran out on those broad bows, our yards, and down fell the sails like white clouds from the ether, topsails, topgallants, and royals, and away we ran with the halyards till every sheet was distended. "Once more to the bars! Heave, my hearties, heave hard!" With a jerk and a yerk we broke ground, and up to our bows came several thousand pounds of old iron in the shape of our ponderous anchor. Where was White Jacket then? White Jacket was where he belonged. It was White Jacket that loosed that main royal so far up aloft there. It looks like a white albatross's wing. It was White Jacket that was taken for an albatross himself, as he flew out on the giddy yard-arm. End of Chapter 2. Recording by James K. White. Chapter 3 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 3. A glance at the principal divisions into which a man-of-war's crew is divided. Having just designated the place where White Jacket belonged, it must needs be related how White Jacket came to belong there. Everyone knows that in merchantmen the seamen are divided into watches, starboard and larboard, taking their turn at the ship's duty by night. This plan is followed in all men of war. But in all men of war, besides this division, there are others, rendered indispensable from the great number of men, and the necessity of precision and discipline. Not only are particular bands assigned to the three tops, but in getting under way, or any other proceeding requiring all hands, particular men of these bands are assigned to each yard of the tops. Thus, when the order is given to loose the main royal, White Jacket flies to obey it, and no one but him. And not only are particular bands stationed on the three decks of the ship at such times, but particular men of those bands are also assigned to particular duties. Also, in tacking ship, reefing topsails, or coming to, every man of a frigate's 500 strong knows his own special place, and is infallibly found there. He sees nothing else, attends to nothing else, and will stay there till grim death or an epaulet orders him away. Yet there are times when, through the negligence of the officers, some exceptions are found to this rule. A rather serious circumstance growing out of such a case will be related in some future chapter. Were it not for these regulations, a man-of-war's crew would be nothing but a mob, more ungovernable stripping the canvas in a gale than Lord George Gordon's tearing down the lofty house of Lord Mansfield. But this is not all. Besides White Jacket's office as looser of the main royal, when all hands were called to make sail, and besides his special offices in tacking ship, coming to anchor, etc., he permanently belonged to the starboard watch, one of the two primary grand divisions of the ship's company, and in this watch he was a maintopman, that is, was stationed in the maintop with a number of other seamen, always in readiness to execute any orders pertaining to the main mast from above the main yard. For, including the main yard and below it to the deck, the main mast belongs to another detachment. Now the fore, main, and mizentop men of each watch, starboard and larboard, are at sea respectively subdivided into quarter watches, which regularly relieve each other in the tops to which they may belong, while collectively they relieve the whole larboard watch of topmen. Besides these topmen, who are always made up of active sailors, there are sheet anchor men, old veterans all, whose place is on the forecastle, the foreyard anchors and all sails on the bowsprit being under their care. They are an old weather-beaten set, culled from the most experienced seamen on board. These are the fellows that sing you "The Bay of Biscay, O," and "Here a sheer hulk lies poor torn bowling," "Cease rude Boreas, blustering railer," who, when ashore at an eating-house, call for a bowl of tar and a biscuit. These are the fellows who spin interminable yarns about Decatur, Hull, and Bainbridge, and carry about their persons bits of old Ironsides, as Catholics do the wood of the true cross. These are the fellows that some officers never pretend to damn, however much they may anathematize others. These are the fellows that it does your soul good to look at, hardy old members of the old guard, grim sea grenadiers, who, in tempest time, have lost many a tarpaulin overboard. These are the fellows whose society some of the youngster midshipmen much affect, from whom they learn their best seamanship, and to whom they look up as veterans, if so be that they have any reverence in their souls, which is not the case with all midshipmen. Then there is the after-guard, stationed on the quarter-deck, who, under the quartermasters and quarter-gunners, attend to the mainsail and spanker, and help haul the main-brace and other ropes in the stern of the vessel. The duties assigned to the after-guard's men being comparatively light and easy, and but little seamanship being expected from them, they are composed chiefly of landsmen, the least robust, least hardy, and least sailor-like of the crew, and, being stationed on the quarter-deck, they are generally selected with some eye to their personal appearance. Hence they are mostly slender young fellows, of a genteel figure and gentlemanly address, not weighing much on a rope, but weighing considerably in the estimation of all foreign ladies who may chance to visit the ship. They lounge away the most part of their time in reading novels and romances, talking over their lover affairs ashore, and comparing notes concerning the melancholy and sentimental career which drove them, poor young gentlemen, into the hard-hearted navy. Indeed, many of them show tokens of having moved in very respectable society. They always maintain a tidy exterior, and express an abhorrence of the tar-bucket, into which they are seldom or never called to dip their digits, and pluming themselves upon the cut of their trousers and the glossiness of their tarpaulins from the rest of the ship's company, they acquire the name of sea-dandies and silk-sock gentry. Then there are the waisters, always stationed on the gun-deck. These haul aft the fore and main sheets, besides being subject to ignoble duties, attending to the drainage and sewerage below hatches. These fellows are all Jimmy Dukeses, sorry chaps who never put foot in ratlin or venture above the bulwarks. Inveterate sons of farmers with the hayseed yet in their hair, they are consigned to the congenial superintendence of the chicken coops, pig pens, and potato lockers. These are generally placed amidships on the gun-deck of a frigate, between the fore and main hatches, and comprise so extensive an area that it much resembles the market-place of a small town. The melodious sounds thence issuing continually draw tears from the eyes of the waisters, reminding them of their old paternal pig-pens and potato patches. They are the tag-rag and bobtail of the crew, and he who is good for nothing else is good enough for a waster. 3 decks down, spar deck, gun deck, and berth deck, and we come to a parcel of troglodytes or holders, who burrow like rabbits in warrens among the water tanks, casks, and cables. Like Cornwall miners, wash off the soot from their skins, and they are all pale as ghosts, unless upon rare occasions they seldom come on deck to sun themselves. They may circumnavigate the world 50 times, and they see about as much of it as Jonah did in the whale's belly. They are a lazy, lumpish, torpid set, and when going ashore after a long cruise, come out into the day like terrapins from their caves, or bears in the spring from tree trunks. No one ever knows the names of these fellows. After a 3 years' voyage they still remain strangers to you. In time of tempests, when all hands are called to save ship, they issue forth into the gale, like the mysterious old men of Paris during the massacre of the 3 days of September. Everyone marvels who they are, and whence they come. They disappear as mysteriously, and are seen no more until another general commotion. Such are the principal divisions into which a man-of-war's crew is divided, but the inferior allotments of duties are endless, and would require a German commentator to chronicle. We say nothing here of boatswain's mates, gunner's mates, carpenter's mates, sailmaker's mates, armorer's mates, master-at-arms, ship's corporals, coxswains, quartermasters, quarter-gunners, captains of the forecastle, captains of the foretop, captains of the maintop, captains of the mizzen-top, captains of the afterguard, captains of the main hold, captains of the forehold, captains of the head, coopers, painters, tinkers, commodore's steward, captain's steward, wardroom steward, steerage steward, commodore's cook, captain's cook, officer's cook, cooks of the range, mess cooks, hammock boys, messenger boys, cot boys, loblolly boys, and numberless others, whose functions are fixed and peculiar. It is from this endless subdivision of duties in a man-of-war that, upon first entering one, a sailor has need of a good memory, and the more of an arithmetician he is, the better. White Jacket, for one, was a long time wrapped in calculations concerning the various numbers allotted him by the first luff, otherwise known as the first lieutenant. In the first place, White Jacket was given the number of his mess, then his ship's number, or the number to which he must answer when the watch roll is called, then the number of his hammock, then the number of the gun to which he was assigned, besides a variety of other numbers, all of which would have taken Jedediah Buxton himself some time to arrange in battalions, previous to adding up. All these numbers, moreover, must be well remembered, or woe betide you. Consider now a sailor altogether unused to the tumult of a man-of-war, for the first time stepping on board and given all these numbers to recollect. Already, before hearing them, his head is half stunned with the unaccustomed sounds ringing in his ears, which ears seem to him like belfries full of tocsins. On the gun-deck 1,000 scythed chariots seem passing. He hears the tread of armed marines, the clash of cutlasses and curses. The boatswain's mates whistle round him, like hawks screaming in a gale, and the strange noises under decks are like volcanic rumblings in a mountain. He dodges sudden sounds as a raw recruit falling bombs. Well nigh useless to him now, all previous circumnavigations of this terraqueous globe, of no account his Arctic, Antarctic, or equinoctial experiences, his gales off Beachy Head, or his dismastings off Hatteras, he must begin anew. He knows nothing. Greek and Hebrew could not help him, for the language he must learn has neither grammar nor lexicon. Mark him, as he advances along the files of old ocean warriors. Mark his debased attitude, his deprecating gestures, his sawney stare, like a Scotchman in London, his cry your merry noble seiners. He is wholly nonplussed and confounded, and when, to crown all, the first lieutenant, whose business it is to welcome all new corners, and assign them their quarters, when this officer, none of the most bland or amiable either, gives him number after number to recollect, 246, 139, 478, 351, the poor fellow feels like decamping. Study, then, your mathematics, and cultivate all your memories, O ye who think of cruising in men of war. End of Chapter 3. Recording by James K. White. Chapter 4 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 4. Jack Chase. The first night out of port was a clear moonlight one, the frigate gliding through the water with all her batteries. It was my quarter watch in the top, and there I reclined on the best possible terms with my topmates. Whatever the other seamen might have been, these were a noble set of tars, and well worthy an introduction to the reader. First and foremost was Jack Chase, our noble first captain of the top. He was a Briton, and a true blue, tall and well-knit, with a clear open eye, a fine broad brow, and an abounding nut-brown beard. No man ever had a better heart or a bolder. He was loved by the seamen and admired by the officers, and even when the captain spoke to him, it was with a slight air of respect. Jack was a frank and charming man. No one could be better company in forecastle or saloon. No man told such stories, sang such songs, or with greater alacrity sprang to his duty. Indeed, there was only one thing wanting about him, and that was a finger of his left hand, which finger he had lost at the great battle of Navarino. He had a high conceit of his profession as a seaman, and being deeply versed in all things pertaining to a man of war, was universally regarded as an oracle. The maintop, over which he presided, was a sort of oracle of Delphi, to which many pilgrims ascended to have their perplexities or differences settled. There was such an abounding air of good sense and good feeling about the man, that he who could not love him would thereby pronounce himself a knave. I thanked my sweet stars that kind fortune had placed me near him, though under him, in the frigate, and from the outset Jack and I were fast friends. Wherever you may be now rolling over the blue billows, dear Jack, take my best love along with you, and God bless you wherever you go. Jack was a gentleman. What though his hand was hard, so was not his heart, too often the case with soft palms. His manners were easy and free, none of the boisterousness so common to tars, and he had a polite, courteous way of saluting you, if it were only to borrow your knife. Jack had read all the verses of Byron, and all the romances of Scott. He talked of Rob Roy, Don Juan, and Pelham, Macbeth and Ulysses, but above all things was an ardent admirer of Camoens. Parts of the Lusiad he could recite in the original. Where he had obtained his wonderful accomplishments, it is not for me, his humble subordinate, to say. Enough that those accomplishments were so various, the languages he could converse in so numerous, that he more than furnished an example of that saying of Charles V, "He who speaks 5 languages is as good as 5 men." But Jack, he was better than 100 common mortals. Jack was a whole phalanx, an entire army. Jack was 1,000 strong. Jack would have done honor to the Queen of England's drawing-room. Jack must have been a by-blow of some British admiral of the blue. A finer specimen of the island race of Englishmen could not have been picked out of Westminster Abbey of a coronation day. His whole demeanor was in strong contrast to that of one of the captains of the foretop. This man, though a good seaman, furnished an example of those insufferable Britons who, while preferring other countries to their own as places of residence, still overflow with all the pompousness of national and individual vanity combined. "When I was on board the Audacious," for a long time, was almost the invariable exordium to the foretop captain's most cursory remarks. It is often the custom of men-of-war's men, when they deem anything to be going on wrong aboard ship, to refer to last cruise, when, of course, everything was done ship-shape and Bristol fashion. And by referring to the Audacious, an expressive name, by the way, the foretop captain meant a ship in the English Navy, in which he had had the honor of serving. So continual were his allusions to this craft with the amiable name, that at last the Audacious was voted a bore by his shipmates. And one hot afternoon, during a calm when the foretop captain, like many others, was standing still and yawning on the spar-deck, Jack Chase, his own countryman, came up to him, and pointing at his open mouth, politely inquired whether that was the way they caught flies in Her Britannic Majesty's ship, the Audacious. After that, we heard no more of the craft. Now, the tops of a frigate are quite spacious and cozy. They are railed in behind so as to form a kind of balcony, very pleasant of a tropical night. From 20 to 30 loungers may agreeably recline there, cushioning themselves on old sails and jackets. We had rare times in that top. We accounted ourselves the best seamen in the ship, and from our airy perch literally looked down upon the landlopers below, sneaking about the deck among the guns. In a large degree, we nourished that feeling of esprit de corps, always pervading, more or less, the various sections of a man-of-war's crew. We main-topmen were brothers, one and all, and we loaned ourselves to each other with all the freedom in the world. Nevertheless, I had not long been a member of this fraternity of fine fellows ere I discovered that Jack Chase, our captain, was, like all prime favorites and oracles among men, a little bit of a dictator. Not peremptorily or annoyingly so, but amusingly intent on egotistically mending our manners and improving our taste, so that we might reflect credit upon our tutor. He made us all wear our hats at a particular angle, instructed us in the tie of our neck-handkerchiefs, and protested against our wearing vulgar dungaree trousers, besides giving us lessons in seamanship, and solemnly conjuring us forever to eschew the company of any sailor we suspected of having served in a whaler. Against all whalers, indeed, he cherished the unmitigated detestation of a true man-of-war's man. Poor Tubbs can testify to that. Tubbs was in the afterguard, a long, lank vineyarder, eternally talking of line tubs, Nantucket, sperm oil, stove boats, and Japan. Nothing could silence him, and his comparisons were ever invidious. Now, with all his soul, Jack abominated this Tubbs. He said he was vulgar, an upstart, devil take him, he's been in a whaler. But like many men who have been where you haven't been, or seen what you haven't seen, Tubbs, on account of his whaling experiences, absolutely affected to look down upon Jack, even as Jack did upon him. And this it was that so enraged our noble captain. One night, with a peculiar meaning in his eye, he sent me down on deck to invite Tubbs up aloft for a chat. Flattered by so marked an honor, for we were somewhat fastidious, and did not extend such invitations to everybody, Tubbs quickly mounted the rigging, looking rather abashed at finding himself in the august presence of the assembled quarter-watch of maintopmen. Jack's courteous manner, however, very soon relieved his embarrassment. But it is no use to be courteous to some men in this world. Tubbs belonged to that category. No sooner did the bumpkin feel himself at ease, than he launched out, as usual, into tremendous laudations of whalemen, declaring that whalemen alone deserve the name of sailors. Jack stood it some time, but when Tubbs came down upon men of war, and particularly upon maintopmen, his sense of propriety was so outraged that he launched into Tubbs like a 42-pounder. "Why, you limb of Nantucket, you train-oil man, you sea-tallow strainer, you bobber after carrion, do you pretend to vilify a man-of-war? Why, you lean rogue, you, a man-of-war is to whalemen as a metropolis to shire towns and sequestered hamlets. Here's the place for life and commotion. Here's the place to be gentlemanly and jolly. And what did you know, you bumpkin, before you came on board this Andrew Miller? What knew you of gun-deck or orlop, mustering round the capstan, beating to quarters and piping to dinner? Did you ever roll to grog on board your greasy ballyhoo of blazes? Did you ever winter at Mahon? Did you ever lash and carry? Why, what are even a merchant seaman's sorry yarns of voyages to China after tea-caddies, and voyages to the West Indies after sugar-puncheons, and voyages to the Shetlands after seal-skins? What are even these yarns, you Tubbs, you, to high life on a man-of-war? Why, you dead-eye, I have sailed with lords and marquises for captains, and the king of the two Sicilies has passed me as I here stood up at my gun. Bah! You are full of the forepeak and the forecastle. You are only familiar with Burtons and billy-tackles. Your ambition never mounted above pig-killing, which in my poor opinion is the proper phrase for whaling. Topmates, has not this Tubbs here been but a misuser of good oak planks, and a vile desecrator of the thrice-holy sea, turning his ship, my hearties, into a fat kettle, and the ocean into a whale-pen? Begone, you graceless, godless knave! Pitch him over the top there, White Jacket." But there was no necessity for my exertions. Poor Tubbs, astounded at these fulminations, was already rapidly descending by the rigging. This outburst on the part of my noble friend Jack made me shake all over, spite of my padded surtout, and caused me to offer up devout thanksgivings that in no evil hour had I divulged the fact of having myself served in a whaler; for, having previously marked the prevailing prejudice of men-of-war's men to that much maligned class of mariners, I had wisely held my peace concerning stove-boats on the coast of Japan. End of Chapter 4. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista. Chapters 5 and 6 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 5. Jack Chase on a Spanish Quarterdeck. Here I must frankly tell a story about Jack, which, as touching his honor and integrity, I am sure, will not work against him, in any charitable man's estimation. On this present cruise of the frigate Neversink, Jack had deserted, and after a certain interval had been captured. But with what purpose had he deserted? To avoid naval discipline? To riot in some abandoned seaport? For love of some worthless señorita? Not at all. He abandoned the frigate from far higher and nobler, nay, glorious motives. Though bowing to naval discipline afloat, yet ashore he was a stickler for the rights of man and the liberties of the world. He went to draw a partisan blade in the civil commotions of Peru, and befriend, heart and soul, what he deemed the cause of the right. At the time, his disappearance excited the utmost astonishment among the officers, who had little suspected him of any such conduct of deserting. "What! Jack, my great man of the maintop, gone?" cried the captain. "I'll not believe it." "Jack Chase cut and run?" cried a sentimental middy. "It must have been all for love, then. The señoritas have turned his head." "Jack Chase not to be found?" cried a growling old sheet-anchor-man, one of your malicious prophets of past events. "I thought so. I knowed it. I could have sworn it. Just the chap to make sail on the sly. I always suspected him." Months passed away, and nothing was heard of Jack, till at last the frigate came to anchor on the coast alongside of a Peruvian sloop of war. Bravely clad in the Peruvian uniform, and with a fine mixed martial and naval step, a tall, striking figure of a long-bearded officer was descried, promenading the quarter-deck of the stranger, and superintending the salutes which are exchanged between national vessels on these occasions. This fine officer touched his laced hat most courteously to our captain, who, after returning the compliment, stared at him rather impolitely through his spy-glass. "By heaven!" he cried at last, "it is he! He can't disguise his walk. That's the beard. I know him in Cochin China. Man the first cutter there. Lieutenant Blink, go on board that sloop of war and fetch me yon officer." All hands were aghast. What? When a piping-hot peace was between the United States and Peru, to send an armed body on board a Peruvian sloop of war, and seize one of its officers in broad daylight? Monstrous infraction of the law of nations. What would Vattel say? But Captain Claret must be obeyed, so off went the cutter, every man armed to the teeth, the lieutenant commanding having secret instructions, and the midshipmen attending, looking ominously wise, though in truth they could not tell what was coming. Gaining the sloop of war, the lieutenant was received with the customary honours, but by this time the tall, bearded officer had disappeared from the quarter-deck. The lieutenant now inquired for the Peruvian captain, and being shown into the cabin, made known to him that on board his vessel was a person belonging to the United States ship Neversink, and his orders were to have that person delivered up instanter. The foreign captain curled his mustache in astonishment and indignation. He hinted something about beating to quarters, and chastising this piece of Yankee insolence. But resting one gloved hand upon the table, and playing with his sword-knot, the lieutenant, with a bland firmness, repeated his demand. At last, the whole case being so plainly made out, and the person in question being so accurately described, even to a mole on his cheek, there remained nothing but immediate compliance. So the fine-looking bearded officer, who had so courteously doffed his chapeau to our captain, but disappeared upon the arrival of the lieutenant, was summoned into the cabin before his superior, who addressed him thus: "Don John, this gentleman declares that of right you belong to the frigate Neversink. Is it so?" "It is even so, Don Sereno," said Jack Chase, proudly folding his gold-laced coat-sleeves across his chest. "And as there is no resisting the frigate, I comply. Lieutenant Blink, I am ready. Adieu, Don Sereno, and Madre de Dios protect you. You have been a most gentlemanly friend and captain to me. I hope you will yet thrash your beggarly foes." With that he turned, and, entering the cutter, was pulled back to the frigate and stepped up to Captain Claret, where that gentleman stood on the quarter-deck. "Your servant, my fine Don," said the captain, ironically lifting his chapeau, but regarding Jack at the same time with a look of intense displeasure. "Your most devoted and penitent captain of the maintop, sir, and one who, in his very humility of contrition, is yet proud to call Captain Claret his commander," said Jack, making a glorious bow, and then tragically flinging overboard his Peruvian sword. "Reinstate him at once," shouted Captain Claret. "And now, sir, to your duty, and discharge that well to the end of the cruise, and you will hear no more of your having run away." So Jack went forward among the crowds of admiring tars, who swore by his nut-brown beard, which had amazingly lengthened and spread during his absence. They divided his laced hat and coat among them, and on their shoulders carried him in triumph along the gun-deck. Chapter 6. The Quarter-deck Officers, Warrant Officers, and Berth-deck Underlings of a Man of War. Where they live in the ship, how they live, their social standing on shipboard, and what sort of gentlemen they are. Some account has been given of the various divisions into which our crew was divided, so it may be well to say something of the officers, who they are, and what are their functions. Our ship, be it known, was the flagship; that is, we sported a broad pennant, or bogey, at the main, in token that we carried a Commodore, the highest rank of officers recognized in the American Navy. The bogey is not to be confounded with the long pennant, or coach-whip, a tapering serpentine streamer worn by all men of war. Owing to certain vague republican scruples about creating great officers of the Navy, America has thus far had no admirals, though, as her ships of war increase, they may become indispensable. This will assuredly be the case, should she ever have occasion to employ large fleets, when she must adopt something like the English plan, and introduce 3 or 4 grades of flag officers above a Commodore, admirals, vice-admirals, and rear-admirals of squadrons, distinguished by the color of their flags, red, white, and blue, corresponding to the center, van, and rear. These rank respectively with generals, lieutenant-generals, and major-generals in the Army, just as Commodore takes rank with a brigadier-general. So that the same prejudice which prevents the American government from creating admirals should have precluded the creation of all army officers above a brigadier. An American Commodore, like an English Commodore or the French chef d'escadre, is but a senior captain, temporarily commanding a small number of ships detached for any special purpose. He has no permanent rank, recognized by government, above his captaincy, though once employed as a Commodore, usage and courtesy unite in continuing the title. Our Commodore was a gallant old man who had seen service in his time. When a lieutenant, he served in the late war with England and in the gunboat actions on the lakes near New Orleans, just previous to the grand land engagements, received a musket ball in his shoulder, which, with the 2 balls in his eyes, he carries about with him to this day. Often, when I looked at the venerable old warrior doubled up from the effect of his wound, I thought what a curious as well as painful sensation it must be to have one's shoulder a lead mine, though, sooth to say, so many of us civilized mortals convert our mouths into Golcondas. On account of this wound in his shoulder, our Commodore had a body servant's pay allowed him, in addition to his regular salary. I cannot say a great deal personally of the Commodore. He never sought my company at all, never extended any gentlemanly courtesies. but though I cannot say much of him personally, I can mention something of him in his general character as a flag officer. In the first place, then, I have serious doubts whether for the most part he was not dumb, for in my hearing he seldom or never uttered a word. And not only did he seem dumb himself, but his presence possessed the strange power of making other people dumb for the time. His appearance on the quarterdeck seemed to give every officer the lockjaw. Another phenomenon about him was the strange manner in which everyone shunned him. At the first sign of those epaulets of his on the weather side of the poop, the officers there congregated invariably shrunk over to leeward and left him alone. Perhaps he had an evil eye. Maybe he was the wandering Jew afloat. The real reason probably was that, like all high functionaries, he deemed it indispensable religiously to sustain his dignity, one of the most troublesome things in the world, and one calling for the greatest self-denial. And the constant watch and many-sided guardedness which this sustaining of a Commodore's dignity requires, plainly enough shows that, apart from the common dignity of manhood, Commodores in general possess no real dignity at all. True, it is expedient for crowned heads, generalissimos, lord high admirals, and commodores to carry themselves straight and beware of the spinal complaint, but it is not the less veritable that it is a piece of assumption exceedingly uncomfortable to themselves and ridiculous to an enlightened generation. Now, how many rare good fellows there were among us maintopmen who, invited into his cabin over a social bottle or two, would have rejoiced our old Commodore's heart and caused that ancient wound of his to heal up at once. Come, come, Commodore, don't look so sour, old boy. Step up aloft here into the top, and we'll spin you a sociable yarn. Truly, I thought myself much happier in that white jacket of mine than our old Commodore in his dignified epaulets. One thing, perhaps, that more than anything else helped to make our Commodore so melancholy and forlorn was the fact of his having so little to do. For as the frigate had a captain, of course, so far as she was concerned, our Commodore was a supernumerary. What abundance of leisure he must have had during a 3 years' cruise! How indefinitely he might have been improving his mind! But as everyone knows that idleness is the hardest work in the world, so our Commodore was specially provided with a gentleman to assist him. This gentleman was called the Commodore's secretary. He was a remarkably urbane and polished man, with a very graceful exterior, and looked much like an ambassador extraordinary from Versailles. He messed with the lieutenants in the ward-room, where he had a state-room, elegantly furnished as the private cabinet of Pelham. His cot-boy used to entertain the sailors with all manner of stories about the silver-keyed flutes and flageolets, fine oil paintings, morocco-bound volumes, Chinese chessmen, gold shirt-buttons, enameled pencil-cases, extraordinary fine French boots with soles no thicker than a sheet of scented note-paper, embroidered vests, incense-burning sealing-wax, alabaster statuettes of Venus and Adonis, tortoise-shell snuff-boxes, inlaid toilet-cases, ivory-handled hair-brushes and mother-of-pearl combs, and 100 other luxurious appendages scattered about this magnificent secretary's state-room. I was a long time in finding out what this secretary's duties comprised, but it seemed he wrote the Commodore's dispatches for Washington, and also was his general amanuensis. Nor was this a very light duty, at times, for some Commodores, though they do not say a great deal on board ship, yet they have a vast deal to write. Very often, the regimental orderly, stationed at our Commodore's cabin door, would touch his hat to the first lieutenant, and with a mysterious air hand him a note. I always thought these notes must contain most important matters of state, until one day, seeing a slip of wet, torn paper in a scupper-hole, I read the following: "Sir, you will give the people pickles today with their fresh meat. To Lieutenant Bridewell, by command of the Commodore." Adolphus Dashman, Private Secretary. This was a new revelation, for from his almost immutable reserve I had supposed that the Commodore never meddled immediately with the concerns of the ship, but left all that to the captain. But the longer we live, the more we learn of Commodores. Turn we now to the second officer in rank, almost supreme, however, in the internal affairs of his ship. Captain Claret was a large, portly man, a Harry the Eighth afloat, bluff and hearty, and as kingly in his cabin as Harry on his throne. For a ship is a bit of terra firma, cut off from the main. It is a state in itself, and the captain is its king. It is no limited monarchy, where the sturdy commons have a right to petition and snarl if they please, but almost a despotism, like the Grand Turks. The captain's word is law. He never speaks but in the imperative mood. When he stands on his quarter-deck at sea, he absolutely commands as far as eye can reach. Only the moon and stars are beyond his jurisdiction. He is lord and master of the sun. It is not 12 o'clock till he says so. For when the sailing master, whose duty it is to take the regular observation at noon, touches his hat, and reports 12 o'clock to the officer of the deck, that functionary orders a midshipman to repair to the captain's cabin, and humbly inform him of the respectful suggestion of the sailing master. 12 o'clock reported, sir, says the middy. Make it so, replies the captain. And the bell is struck 8 by the messenger boy, and 12 o'clock it is. As in the case of the Commodore, when the captain visits the deck, his subordinate officers generally beat a retreat to the other side, and, as a general rule, would no more think of addressing him, except concerning the ship, than a lackey would think of hailing the Czar of Russia on his throne, and inviting him to tea. Perhaps no mortal man has more reason to feel such an intense sense of his own personal consequence as the captain of a man-of-war at sea. Next in rank comes the first or senior lieutenant, the chief executive officer. I have no reason to love the particular gentleman who filled that post aboard our frigate, for it was he who refused my petition for as much black paint as would render waterproof that white jacket of mine. All my soakings and drenchings lie at his stateroom door. I hardly think I shall ever forgive him. Every twinge of the rheumatism which I still occasionally feel is directly referable to him. The immortals have a reputation for clemency, and they may pardon him, but he must not dun me to be merciful. But my personal feelings toward the man shall not prevent me from here doing him justice. In most things he was an excellent seaman, prompt, loud, and to the point, and as such was well fitted for his station. The first lieutenancy of a frigate demands a good disciplinarian, and, every way, an energetic man. By the captain he is held responsible for everything. By that magnate, indeed, he is supposed to be omnipresent, down in the hold and up aloft at one and the same time. He presides at the head of the wardroom officers' table, who are so called from their messing together in a part of the ship thus designated. In a frigate it comprises the after part of the berth deck. Sometimes it goes by the name of the gun-room, but oftener is called the ward-room. Within this ward-room much resembles a long, wide corridor in a large hotel, numerous doors opening on both hands to the private apartments of the officers. I never had a good interior look at it but once, and then the chaplain was seated at the table in the center, playing chess with the lieutenant of marines. It was midday, but the place was lighted by lamps. Besides the first lieutenant, the wardroom officers include the junior lieutenants. In a frigate, 6 or 7 in number, the sailing master, purser, chaplain, surgeon, marine officers, and midshipman schoolmaster, or the professor. They generally form a very agreeable club of good fellows, from their diversity of character, admirably calculated to form an agreeable social whole. The lieutenants discuss sea fights, and tell anecdotes of Lord Nelson and Lady Hamilton. The marine officers talk of storming fortresses and the siege of Gibraltar. The purser steadies this wild conversation by occasional allusions to the Rule of Three. The professor is always charged with a scholarly reflection or an apt line from the classics, generally Ovid. The surgeon's stories of the amputation table judiciously serve to suggest the mortality of the whole party as men, while the good chaplain stands ready at all times to give them pious counsel and consolation. Of course, these gentlemen all associate on a footing of perfect social equality. Next in order come the warrant or forward officers, consisting of the boatswain, gunner, carpenter, and sailmaker. Though these worthies sport long coats and wear the anchor button, yet in the estimation of the wardroom officers they are not, technically speaking, rated gentlemen. The first lieutenant, chaplain, or surgeon, for example, would never dream of inviting them to dinner. In sea parlance, they come in at the hawse-holes. They have hard hands, and the carpenter and sailmaker practically understand the duties which they are called upon to superintend. They mess by themselves, invariably 4 in number. They never have need to play whist with a dummy. In this part of the category now come the reefers, otherwise middies or midshipmen. These boys are sent to sea for the purpose of making commodores, and in order to become commodores, many of them deem it indispensable forthwith to commence chewing tobacco, drinking brandy and water, and swearing at the sailors. As they are only placed on board a sea-going ship to go to school and learn the duty of a lieutenant, and until qualified to act as such, have few or no special functions to attend to. They are little more, while midshipmen, than supernumeraries on board. Hence, in a crowded frigate, they are so everlastingly crossing the path of both men and officers, that in the Navy it has become a proverb that a useless fellow is as much in the way as a reefer. In a gale of wind, when all hands are called and the deck swarms with men, the little middies, running about distracted and having nothing particular to do, make it up in vociferous swearing, exploding all about underfoot like torpedoes. Some of them are terrible little boys, cocking their cups at alarming angles, and looking fierce as young roosters. They are generally great consumers of Macassar oil and the balm of Columbia. They thirst and rage after whiskers, and sometimes, applying their ointments, lay themselves out in the sun to promote the fertility of their chins. As the only way to learn to command is to learn to obey, the usage of a ship of war is such that the midshipmen are constantly being ordered about by the lieutenants. Though, without having assigned them their particular destinations, they are always going somewhere and never arriving. In some things they almost have a harder time of it than the seamen themselves. They are messengers and errand boys to their superiors. "Mr. Pert!" cries an officer of the deck, hailing a young gentleman forward. Mr. Pert advances, touches his hat, and remains in an attitude of deferential suspense. "Go and tell the boatswain I want him." And with this perilous errand, the middy hurries away, looking proud as a king. The middies live by themselves in the steerage, where nowadays they dine off a table spread with a cloth. They have a caster at dinner. They have some other little boys selected from the ship's company to wait upon them. They sometimes drink coffee out of china. But for all these, their modern refinements, in some instances the affairs of their club go sadly to rack and ruin. The china is broken, the japanned coffee-pot dented like a pewter mug in an ale-house. The pronged forks resemble toothpicks, for which they are sometimes used. The table knives are hacked into handsaws, and the cloth goes to the sailmaker to be patched. Indeed, They are something like collegiate freshmen and sophomores living in the college buildings, especially so far as the noise they make in their quarters is concerned. The steerage buzzes, hums, and swarms like a hive, or like an infant school of a hot day when the schoolmistress falls asleep with a fly on her nose. In frigates, the wardroom, the retreat of the lieutenants, immediately adjoining the steerage, is on the same deck with it. Frequently, when the middies, waking early in the morning, as most youngsters do, would be kicking up their heels in their hammocks or running about with double-reefed nightgowns, playing tag among the clews, the senior lieutenant would burst among them with a, "Young gentlemen, I am astonished. You must stop this skylarking. Mr. Pert, what are you doing at the table there, without your pantaloons? To your hammock, sir. Let me see no more of this. If you disturb the wardroom again, young gentlemen, you shall hear of it." And so saying, this hoary-headed senior lieutenant would retire to his cot in his stateroom, like the father of a numerous family after getting up in his dressing-gown and slippers to quiet a daybreak tumult in his populous nursery. Having now descended from Commodore to Middy, we come lastly to a set of nondescripts, forming also a mess by themselves, apart from the seamen. Into this mess the usage of a man-of-war thrusts various subordinates, including the master-at-arms, purser's steward, ship's corporals, marine sergeants, and ship's yeomen, forming the first aristocracy above the sailors. The master-at-arms is a sort of high constable and schoolmaster, wearing citizen's clothes, and known by his official rattan. He it is whom all sailors hate. His is the universal duty of a universal informer and hunter-up of delinquents. On the berth-deck he reigns supreme, spying out all grease-spots made by the various cooks of the seamen's messes, and driving the laggards up the hatches when all hands are called. It is indispensable that he should be a very vidocq in vigilance. But as it is a heartless, so it is a thankless office. Of dark nights, most masters-of-arms keep themselves in readiness to dodge 42-pound balls dropped down the hatchways near them. The ship's corporals are this worthy's deputies and ushers. The marine sergeants are generally tall fellows, with unyielding spines and stiff upper lips, and very exclusive in their tastes and predilections. The ship's yeoman is a gentleman, who has a sort of counting-room in a tar-cellar down in the forehold. More will be said of him anon. Except the officers above enumerated, there are none who mess apart from the seamen. The petty officers, so called, that is, the boatswains, gunners, carpenters, and sailmakers' mates, the captains of the tops, of the forecastle and of the afterguard, and of the fore and main holds, and the quartermasters, all mess in common with the crew, and in the American Navy are only distinguished from the common seamen by their slightly additional pay. But in the English Navy they wear crowns and anchors worked on the sleeves of their jackets, by way of badges of office. In the French Navy they are known by strips of worsted, worn in the same place, like those designating the sergeants and corporals in the army. Thus it will be seen that the dinner-table is the criterion of rank in our man-of-war world. The Commodore dines alone, because he is the only man of his rank in the ship. So, too, with the captain, and the wardroom officers, warrant officers, midshipmen, the master-at-arms mess, and the common seamen. All of them, respectively, dine together, because they are, respectively, on a footing of equality. End of chapters 5 and 6. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista. Chapter 7 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 7. Breakfast, Dinner, and Supper. Not only is the dinner table a criterion of rank on board a man of war, but also the dinner hour. He who dines latest is the greatest man, and he who dines earliest is accounted the least. In a flagship, the Commodore generally dines about 4 or 5 o'clock, the captain about 3, the lieutenants about 2, while the people, by which phrase the common seamen are specially designated in the nomenclature of the quarter-deck, sit down to their salt beef exactly at noon. Thus it will be seen that while the two estates of sea kings and sea lords dine at rather patrician hours, and thereby, in the long run, impair their digestive functions, the sea commoners, or the people, keep up their constitutions by keeping up the good old-fashioned Elizabethan, Franklin-warranted dinner hour of 12. 12 o'clock. It is the natural center, keystone, and very heart of the day. At that hour the sun has arrived at the top of his hill, and as he seems to hang poised there a while before coming down on the other side, it is but reasonable to suppose that he is then stopping to dine, setting an eminent example to all mankind. The rest of the day is called afternoon, the very sound of which fine old Saxon word conveys a feeling of the lee bulwarks and a nap. A summer sea, soft breezes creeping over it, dreamy dolphins gliding in the distance. Afternoon. The word implies that it is an after-piece, coming after the grand drama of the day, something to be taken leisurely and lazily. But how can this be if you dine at 5? For, after all, though Paradise Lost be a noble poem, and we men of war's men, no doubt, largely partake in the immortality of the immortals, yet, let us candidly confess it, shipmates, that, upon the whole, our dinners are the most momentous attains of these lives we lead beneath the moon. What were a day without a dinner? A dinnerless day. Such a day had better be a night. Again, 12 o'clock is the natural hour for us men of war's men to dine, because at that hour the very timepieces we have invented arrive at their terminus. They can get no further than 12, when straightway they continue their old rounds again. Doubtless Adam and Eve dined at 12, and the patriarch Abraham in the midst of his cattle, and old Job with his noon mowers and reapers in that grand plantation of Uz. And old Noah himself in the ark must have gone to dinner at precisely 8 bells, noon, with all his floating families and farmyards. But though this antediluvian dinner hour is rejected by modern commodores and captains, it still lingers among the people under their command. Many sensible things banished from high life find an asylum among the mob. Some commodores are very particular in seeing to it that no man on board the ship dare to dine after his, the Commodore's, own dessert is cleared away. Not even the captain. It is said, on good authority, that a captain once ventured to dine at 5 when the Commodore's hour was 4. Next day, as the story goes, that captain received a private note, and, in consequence of that note, dined for the future at 3:30. Though, in respect of the dinner hour on board a man of war, the people have no reason to complain, yet they have just cause, almost for mutiny, in the outrageous hours assigned for their breakfast and supper. 8 o'clock for breakfast, 12 for dinner, 4 for supper, and no meals but these, no lunches and no cold snacks. Owing to this arrangement, and partly to one watch going to their meals before the other at sea, all the meals of the 24 hours are crowded into a space of less than 8. 16 mortal hours elapse between supper and breakfast, including, to one watch, 8 hours on deck. This is barbarous. Any physician will tell you so. Think of it. Before the Commodore has dined, you have supped, and in high latitudes in summertime, you have taken your last meal for the day, and 5 hours or more daylight to spare. Mr. Secretary of the Navy, in the name of the people, you should interpose in this matter. Many a time have I, a maintopman, found myself actually faint of a tempestuous morning watch, when all my energies were demanded, owing to this miserable, unphilosophical mode of allotting the government meals at sea. We beg you, Mr. Secretary, not to be swayed in this matter by the Honorable Board of Commodores, who will no doubt tell you that 8, 12, and 4 are the proper hours for the people to take their meals, inasmuch as at these hours the watches are relieved. For though this arrangement makes a neater and cleaner thing of it for the officers, and looks very nice and superfine on paper, yet it is plainly detrimental to health, and in time of war is attended with still more serious consequences to the whole nation at large. If the necessary researches were made, it would perhaps be found that in those instances where men of war, adopting the above-mentioned hours for meals, have encountered an enemy at night, they have pretty generally been beaten. That is, in those cases where the enemy's meal times were reasonable, which is only to be accounted for by the fact that the people of the beaten vessels were fighting on an empty stomach instead of a full one. End of Chapter 7. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista. Chapter 8 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 8. Selvagee contrasted with Mad Jack. Having glanced at the grand divisions of a man of war, let us now descend to specialties, and particularly to 2 of the junior lieutenants, lords and noblemen, members of that house of peers, the gun-room. There were several young lieutenants on board, but from these 2, representing the extremes of character to be found in their department, the nature of the other officers of their grade in the Neversink must be derived. One of these 2 quarter-deck lords went among the sailors by a name of their own devising, Selvagee. Of course, it was intended to be characteristic, and even so it was. In frigates and all large ships of war, when getting under way, a large rope called a messenger, used to carry the strain of the cable to the capstan, so that the anchor may be weighed without the muddy, ponderous cable itself going round the capstan. As the cable enters the hawse hole, therefore, something must be constantly used to keep this traveling chain attached to this traveling messenger, something that may be rapidly wound round both, so as to bind them together. The article used is called a selvagee, and what could be better adapted to the purpose? It is a slender, tapering, unstranded piece of rope prepared with much solicitude, peculiarly flexible, and wreaths and serpentines round the cable and messenger like an elegantly modelled garter snake round the twisted stalks of a vine. Indeed, selvagee is the exact type and symbol of a tall, genteel, limber, spiralizing exquisite. So much for the derivation of the name which the sailors applied to the lieutenant. From what sea alcove, from what mermaid's milliner's shop, hast thou emerged, Selvagee, with that dainty waist and languid cheek? What heartless step-dame drove thee forth, to waste thy fragrance on the salt sea air? Was it you, Selvagee, that, outward bound off Cape Horn, looked at Hermit Island through an opera-glass? Was it you who thought of proposing to the captain that, when the sails were furled in a gale, a few drops of lavender should be dropped in their bunts, so that when the canvas was set again, your nostrils might not be offended by its musty smell? I do not say it was you, Selvagee. I but deferentially inquire. In plain prose, Selvagee was one of those officers whom the sight of a trim-fitting naval coat had captivated in the days of his youth. He fancied that if a sea officer dressed well, and conversed genteelly, he would abundantly uphold the honor of his flag, and immortalize the tailor that made him. On that rock many young gentlemen split, for upon a frigate's quarter-deck it is not enough to sport a coat fashioned by a Stultz. It is not enough to be well braced with straps and suspenders. It is not enough to have sweet reminiscences of Lauras and Matildas. It is a right-down life of hard wear and tear, and the man who is not, in a good degree, fitted to become a common sailor will never make an officer. Take that to heart, all ye naval aspirants. Thrust your arms up to the elbow and pitch, and see how you like it, ere you solicit a warrant. Prepare for white squalls, living gales, and typhoons. Read accounts of shipwrecks and horrible disasters. Peruse the narratives of Byron and Bligh. Familiarize yourselves with the story of the English frigate Alceste and the French frigate Medusa, though you may go ashore now and then, at Cadiz and Palermo, for every day so spent among oranges and ladies, you will have whole months of rains and gales. And even thus did Selvagee prove it. But with all the intrepid effeminacy of your true dandy, he still continued his Cologne water baths, and sported his lace-bordered handkerchiefs in the very teeth of a tempest. Alas, Selvagee, there was no getting the lavender out of you. But Selvagee was no fool. Theoretically, he understood his profession, but the mere theory of seamanship forms but the 1,000th part of what makes a seaman. You cannot save a ship by working out a problem in the cabin. The deck is the field of action. Well aware of his deficiency in some things, Selvagee never took the trumpet, which is the badge of the deck officer for the time, without a tremulous movement of the lip, and an earnest inquiring eye to the windward. He encouraged those old Tritons, the quartermasters, to discourse with him concerning the likelihood of a squall, and often followed their advice as to taking in or making sail. The smallest favors in that way were thankfully received. Sometimes, when all the North looked unusually lowering by many conversational blandishments, he would endeavor to prolong his predecessor's stay on deck, after that officer's watch had expired. But in fine, steady weather, when the captain would emerge from his cabin, Selvagee might be seen pacing the poop with long, bold, indefatigable strides, and casting his eye up aloft with the most ostentatious fidelity. But vain these pretenses, he could not deceive. Selvagee, you know very well that if it comes on to blow pretty hard, the first lieutenant will be sure to interfere with his paternal authority. Every man and every boy in the frigate knows, Selvagee, that you are no Neptune. How unenviable his situation! His brother officers do not insult him, to be sure, but sometimes their looks are as daggers. The sailors do not laugh at him outright, but of dark nights they jeer, when they hearken to that mantua-maker's voice ordering a strong pull at the main brace, or hands by the halyards. Sometimes, by way of being terrific, and making the men jump, Selvagee raps out an oath, but the soft balm stuffed with confectioner's kisses seems to burst like a crushed rosebud diffusing its odors. Selvagee, selvagey. Take a maintopman's advice, and this cruise over, never more tempt the sea. With this gentleman of cravats and curling irons, how strongly contrasts the man who was born in a gale, for in some time of tempest, off Cape Horn or Hatteras, Mad Jack must have entered the world. Such things have been. Not with a silver spoon, but with a speaking trumpet in his mouth, wrapped in a caul, as in a mainsail, for a charmed life against shipwrecks he bears, and crying, "Luff, luff, you may! Steady! Port! World ho! Here I am!" Mad Jack is in his saddle on the sea. That is his home. He would not care much if another flood came and overflowed the dry land, for what would it do but float his good ship higher and higher, and carry his proud nation's flag round the globe, over the very capitals of all hostile states. Then would masts surmount spires, and all mankind, like the Chinese boatmen on Canton River, live in flotillas and fleets, and find their food in the sea. Mad Jack was expressly created and labeled for a tar. 5 feet 9 is his mark in his socks, and not weighing over 11 stone before dinner. Like so many ships' shrouds, his muscles and tendons are all set true, trim, and taut. He is braced up fore and aft, like a ship on the wind. His broad chest is a bulkhead that dams off the gale, and his nose is an aquiline that divides it in two, like a keel. His loud, lusty lungs are 2 belfries, full of all manner of chimes, but you only hear his deepest bray in the height of some tempest, like the great bell of St. Paul's, which only sounds when the king or the devil is dead. Look at him there, where he stands on the poop, 1 foot on the rail, and 1 hand on a shroud, his head thrown back, and his trumpet like an elephant's trunk thrown up in the air. Is he going to shoot dead with sounds those fellows on the main topsail yard? Mad Jack was a bit of a tyrant. They say all good officers are. But the sailors loved him all round, and would much rather stand 50 watches with him than one with a Rosewater sailor. But Mad Jack, alas, has one fearful failing. He drinks. And so do we all. But Mad Jack, he only drinks brandy. The vice was inveterate, surely, like Ferdinand, Count Fathom. He must have been suckled at a puncheon. Very often this bad habit got him into very serious scrapes. Twice was he put off duty by the Commodore, and once he came near being broken for his frolics. So far as his efficiency as a sea officer was concerned, on shore at least, Jack might bouse away as much as he pleased, but afloat it will not do at all. Now, if he only followed the wise example set by those ships of the desert, the camels, and while in port, drank for the thirst past, the thirst present, and the thirst to come, so that he might cross the ocean sober, Mad Jack would get along pretty well. Still better, if he would but eschew brandy altogether, and only drink of the limpid white wine of the rills and the brooks. End of Chapter 8. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapters 9 and 10 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 9. Of the Pockets that were in the Jacket. I must make some further mention of that white jacket of mine, and here be it known, by way of introduction to what is to follow, that to a common sailor, the living on board a man of war is like living in a market, where you dress on the doorsteps and sleep in the cellar. No privacy can you have, hardly one moment's seclusion. it is almost a physical impossibility that you can ever be alone. You dine at a vast table d'hôte, sleep in commons, and make your toilet where and when you can. There is no calling for a mutton chop and a pint of claret by yourself, no selecting of chambers for the night, no hanging of pantaloons over the back of a chair, no ringing your bell of a rainy morning to take your coffee in bed. It is something like life in a large manufactory. The bell strikes to dinner, and hungry or not, you must dine. Your clothes are stored in a large canvas bag, generally painted black, which you can get out of the rack only once in the 24 hours, and then, during a time of the utmost confusion, among 500 other bags, with 500 other sailors diving into each, in the midst of the twilight of the berth deck. In some measure, to obviate this inconvenience, many sailors divide their wardrobes between their hammocks and their bags, stowing a few frocks and trousers in the former, so that they can shift at night, if they wish, when the hammocks are piped down. But they gain very little by this. You have no place whatever but your bag or hammock, in which to put anything in a man of war. If you lay anything down and turn your back for a moment, 10 to 1 it is gone. Now, in sketching the preliminary plan and laying out the foundation of that memorable white jacket of mine, I had had an earnest eye to all these inconveniences, and resolved to avoid them. I proposed that not only should my jacket keep me warm, but that it should also be so constructed as to contain a shirt or two, a pair of trousers and divers knickknacks, sewing utensils, books, biscuits, and the like. With this object I had accordingly provided it with a great variety of pockets, pantries, clothes presses, and cupboards. The principal apartments, 2 in number, were placed in the skirts, with a wide, hospitable entrance from the inside. 2 more, of smaller capacity, were planted in each breast, with folding doors communicating, so that in case of emergency, to accommodate any bulky articles, the 2 pockets in each breast could be thrown into one. There were also several unseen recesses behind the arras, insomuch that my jacket, like an old castle, was full of winding stairs and mysterious closets, crypts and cabinets, and like a confidential writing desk, abounded in snug little out-of-the-way lairs and hiding-places for the storage of valuables. Superadded to these were 4 capacious pockets on the outside, 1 pair to slip books into when suddenly startled from my studies to the main royal yard, and the other pair for permanent mittens to thrust my hands into of a cold night watch. This last contrivance was regarded as needless by one of my top-mates, who showed me a pattern for sea mittens, which he said was much better than mine. It must be known that sailors, even in the bleakest weather, only cover their hands when unemployed. They never wear mittens aloft, since aloft they literally carry their lives in their hands, and want nothing between their grasp of the hemp and the hemp itself. Therefore, it is desirable that whatever things they cover their hands with should be capable of being slipped on and off in a moment. Nay, it is desirable that they should be of such a nature that in a dark night, when you are in a great hurry, say going to the helm, they may be jumped into indiscriminately, and not be like a pair of right and left kids, neither of which will admit any hand but the particular one meant for it. My top-mate's contrivance was this. He ought to have got out a patent for it. Each of his mittens was provided with 2 thumbs, 1 on each side, the convenience of which needs no comment. But though for clumsy seamen whose fingers are all thumbs, this description of mitten might do very well, White Jacket did not so much fancy it, for when your hand was once in the bag of the mitten, the empty thumb-hole sometimes dangled at your palm, confounding your ideas of where your real thumb might be, or else, being carefully grasped in the hand, was continually suggesting the insane notion that you were all the while having hold of someone else's thumb. No, I told my good top-mate to go away with his 4 thumbs. I would have nothing to do with them. 2 thumbs were enough for any man. For some time after completing my jacket, and getting the furniture and household stores in it, I thought that nothing could exceed it for convenience. Seldom now did I have occasion to go to my bag, and be jostled by the crowd who were making their wardrobe in a heap. If I wanted anything in the way of clothing, thread, needles, or literature, the chances were that my invaluable jacket contained it. Yes, I fairly hugged myself and reveled in my jacket, till, alas, a long rain put me out of conceit of it. I and all my pockets and their contents were soaked through and through, and my pocket edition of Shakespeare was reduced to an omelet. However, availing myself of a fine sunny day that followed, I emptied myself out in the maintop, and spread all my goods and chattels to dry. But spite of the bright sun, that day proved a black one. The scoundrels on deck detected me in the act of discharging my saturated cargo. They now knew that the white jacket was used for a storehouse. The consequence was that, my goods being well dried and again stored away in my pockets, the very next night, when it was my quarter watch on deck, and not in the top, where they were all honest men, I noticed a parcel of fellows skulking about after me wherever I went. To a man, they were pickpockets, and bent upon pillaging me. In vain I kept clapping my pocket like a nervous old gentleman in a crowd. That same night I found myself minus several valuable articles. So, in the end, I masoned up my lockers and pantries, and save the 2 used for mittens, the white jacket ever after was pocketless. Chapter 10. From Pockets to Pickpockets. As the latter part of the preceding chapter may seem strange to those landsmen who have been habituated to indulge in high-raised, romantic notions of the man-of-war's man's character, it may not be amiss to set down here certain facts on this head, which may serve to place the thing in its true light. From the wild life they lead, and various other causes, needless to mention, sailors, as a class, entertain the most liberal notions concerning morality and the Decalogue, or rather they take their own views of such matters, caring little for the theological or ethical definitions of others concerning what may be criminal or wrong. Their ideas are much swayed by circumstances. They will covertly abstract a thing from one whom they dislike, and insist upon it that in such a case stealing is not robbing, or where the theft involves something funny, as in the case of the white jacket, they only steal for the sake of the joke. But this much is to be observed nevertheless, i.e., that they never spoil the joke by returning the stolen article. It is a good joke, for instance, and one often perpetrated on board ship, to stand talking to a man in a dark night watch, and all the while be cutting the buttons from his coat. But, once off, those buttons never grow on again. There is no spontaneous vegetation in buttons. Perhaps it is a thing unavoidable, but the truth is that, among the crew of a man-of-war, scores of desperadoes are too often found, who stop not at the largest enormities. A species of highway robbery is not unknown to them. A gang will be informed that such a fellow has 3 or 4 gold pieces in the money-bag, so-called, or purse, which many tars wear round their necks, tucked out of sight. Upon this, they deliberately lay their plans, and in due time proceed to carry them into execution. The man they have marked is perhaps strolling along the benighted berth-deck to his mess-chest, when of a sudden the footpads dash out from their hiding-place, throw him to the ground, and while 2 or 3 gag him and hold him fast, another cuts the bag from his neck and makes away with it, followed by his comrades. This was more than once done in the Neversink. At other times, hearing that a sailor has something valuable secreted in his hammock, they will rip it open from underneath while he sleeps, and reduce the conjecture to a certainty. To enumerate all the minor pilferings on board a man-of-war would be endless. With some highly commendable exceptions, they rob from one another, and rob back again, till, in the matter of small things, a community of goods seems almost established, and at last, as a whole, they become relatively honest, by nearly every man becoming the reverse. It is in vain that the officers, by threats of condign punishment, endeavor to instill more virtuous principles into their crew. So thick is the mob, that not one thief in 1,000 is detected. End of chapters 9 and 10. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista. Chapter 11 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 11. The Pursuit of Poetry Under Difficulties. The feeling of insecurity concerning one's possessions in the Neversink, which the things just narrated begat in the minds of honest men, was curiously exemplified in the case of my poor friend Lemsford, a gentlemanly young member of the after-guard. I had very early made the acquaintance of Lemsford. It is curious how unerringly a man pitches upon a spirit, any way akin to his own, even in the most miscellaneous mob. Lemsford was a poet, so thoroughly inspired with the divine afflatus that not even all the tar and tumult of a man of war could drive it out of him. As may readily be imagined, the business of writing verse is a very different thing on the gun-deck of a frigate, from what the gentle and sequestered Wordsworth found it at placid Rydal Mount in Westmoreland. In a frigate, you cannot sit down and meander off your sonnets when the full heart prompts, but only when more important duties permit, such as bracing round the yards or reefing up topsails fore and aft. Nevertheless, every fragment of time at his command was religiously devoted by Lemsford to the 9. At the most unseasonable hours you would behold him seated apart, in some corner among the guns, a shot-box before him, pen in hand, and eyes in a fine frenzy rolling. "What's that air-born natural about? He's got a fit, ain't he?" were exclamations often made by the less learned of his shipmates. Some deemed him a conjurer, others a lunatic, and the knowing ones said that he must be a crazy Methodist. But well knowing by experience the truth of the saying, that poetry is its own exceeding great reward, Lemsford wrote on, dashing off whole epics, sonnets, ballads, and acrostics, with a facility which, under the circumstances, amazed me. Often he read over his effusions to me, and well worth the hearing they were. He had wit, imagination, feeling, and humor in abundance, and out of the very ridicule with which some persons regarded him, he made rare metrical sport, which we two together enjoyed by ourselves, or shared with certain select friends. Still, the taunts and jeers so often levelled at my friend the poet would now and then rouse him into rage, and at such times the haughty scorn he would hurl on his foes was proof positive of his possession of that one attribute, irritability, almost universally ascribed to the votaries of Parnassus and the 9. My noble Captain Jack Chase rather patronized Lemsford, and he would stoutly take his part against scores of adversaries. Frequently inviting him up aloft into his top, he would beg him to recite some of his verses, to which he would pay the most heedful attention, like Maecenas listening to Virgil, with a book of Aeneid in his hand. Taking the liberty of a well-wisher, he would sometimes gently criticize the piece, suggesting a few immaterial alterations. And, upon my word, noble Jack, with his native-born good sense, taste, and humanity, was not ill qualified to play the true part of a quarterly review. which is, to give quarter at last, however severe the critique. Now, Lemsford's great care, anxiety, and endless source of tribulation was the preservation of his manuscripts. He had a little box, about the size of a small dressing-case, and secured with a lock, in which he kept his papers and stationery. This box, of course, he could not keep in his bag or hammock, for, in either case, he would only be able to get at it once in the 24 hours. It was necessary to have it accessible at all times, so when not using it, he was obliged to hide it out of sight where he could, and of all places in the world, a ship of war above her hold least abounds in secret nooks. Almost every inch is occupied, almost every inch is in plain sight, and almost every inch is continually being visited and explored. Added to all this was the deadly hostility of the whole tribe of ship underlings, master-at-arms, ship's corporals and boatswain's mates, both to the poet and his casket. They hated his box as if it had been Pandora's, crammed to the very lid with hurricanes and gales. They hunted out his hiding places like pointers, and gave him no peace, night or day. Still, the long 24-pounders on the main deck offered some promise of a hiding place to the box, and, accordingly, it was often tucked away behind the carriages, among the side tackles, its black color blending with the ebon hue of the guns. But Quinn, one of the quarter-gunners, had eyes like a ferret. Quinn was a little old man-of-war's man, hardly 5 feet high, with a complexion like a gunshot wound after it is healed. He was indefatigable in attending to his duties, which consisted in taking care of one division of the guns, embracing 10 of the aforesaid 24-pounders. Ranged up against the ship's side at regular intervals, they resembled not a little a stud of sable chargers in their stall. Among this iron stud, little Quinn was continually running in and out, currying them down, now and then, with an old rag, or keeping the flies off with a brush. To Quinn, the honor and dignity of the United States of America seemed indissolubly linked with the keeping his guns unspotted and glossy. He himself was black as a chimney-sweep, with continually tending them, and rubbing them down with black paint. He would sometimes get outside of the port-holes and peer into their muzzles, as a monkey into a bottle, or, like a dentist, he seemed intent upon examining their teeth. Quite as often he would be brushing out their touch-holes with a little wisp of oakum, like a Chinese barber in Canton, cleaning a patient's ear. Such was his solicitude, that it was a thousand pities he was not able to dwarf himself still more, so as to creep in at the touch-hole, and, examining the whole interior of the tube, emerge at last from the muzzle. Quinn swore by his guns, and slept by their side. Woe betide the man whom he found leaning against them, or in any way soiling them. He seemed seized with the crazy fancy that his darling 24-pounders were fragile and might break like glass retorts. Now, from this Quinn's vigilance, how could my poor friend the poet hope to escape with his box? 20 times a week it was pounced upon, with a "Here's that pill-box again," and a loud threat to pitch it overboard the next time, without a moment's warning, or benefit of clergy. Like many poets, Lemsford was nervous, and upon these occasions he trembled like a leaf. Once, with an inconsolable countenance, he came to me, saying that his casket was nowhere to be found. He had sought for it in his hiding-place, and it was not there. I asked him where he had hidden it. "Among the guns," he replied. "Then depend upon it, Lemsford, that Quinn has been the death of it." Straight to Quinn went the poet, but Quinn knew nothing about it. For 10 mortal days the poet was not to be comforted, dividing his leisure time between cursing Quinn and lamenting his loss. The world is undone, he must have thought. No such calamity has befallen it since the deluge. My verses are perished. But though Quinn, as it afterward turned out, had indeed found the box, it so happened that he had not destroyed it, which no doubt led Lemsford to infer that a superintending Providence had interposed to preserve to posterity his invaluable casket. It was found at last lying exposed near the galley. Lemsford was not the only literary man on board the Neversink. There were 3 or 4 persons who kept journals of the cruise. One of these journalists embellished his work, which was written in a large blank account book, with various colored illustrations of the harbors and bays at which the frigate had touched, and also with small crayon sketches of comical incidents on board the frigate itself. He would frequently read passages of his book to an admiring circle of the more refined sailors between the guns. They pronounced the whole performance a miracle of art. As the author declared to them that it was all to be printed and published so soon as the vessel reached home, they vied with each other in procuring interesting items to be incorporated into additional chapters. But it having been rumored abroad that this journal was to be ominously entitled "The Cruise of the Neversink, or a Paysan Shot into Naval Abuses," and it having also reached the ears of the wardroom that the work contained reflections somewhat derogatory to the dignity of the officers, the volume was seized by the master-at-arms, armed with a warrant from the captain. A few days after, a large nail was driven straight through the 2 covers, and clenched on the other side, and thus everlastingly sealed, the book was committed to the deep. The ground taken by the authorities on this occasion was, perhaps, that the book was obnoxious to a certain clause in the Articles of War, forbidding any person in the Navy to bring any other person in the Navy into contempt, which the suppressed volume undoubtedly did. End of Chapter 11. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista. Chapter 12 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 12. The good or bad temper of men-of-war's men, in a great degree, attributable to their particular stations and duties aboard ship. Quinn, the quarter-gunner, was the representative of a class on board the Neversink, altogether too remarkable to be left astern, without further notice, in the rapid wake of these chapters. As has been seen, Quinn was full of unaccountable whimsies. He was, withal, a very cross, bitter, ill-natured, inflammable old man. So, too, were all the members of the gunner's gang, including the 2 gunner's mates and all the quarter-gunners. Every one of them had the same dark-brown complexion. All their faces looked like smoked hams. They were continually grumbling and growling about the batteries, running in and out among the guns, driving the sailors away from them, and cursing and swearing as if all their conscience had been powder-singed and made callous by their calling. Indeed, they were a most unpleasant set of men, especially Priming, the nasal-voiced gunner's mate with the hare lip, and Cylinder, his stuttering coadjutor with the club foot. But you will always observe that the gunner's gang of every man of war are invariably ill-tempered, ugly-featured, and quarrelsome. Once, when I visited an English line of battleship, the gunner's gang were fore and aft, polishing up the batteries, which, according to the Admiral's fancy, had been painted white as snow. Fidgeting round the great 32-pounders, and making stinging remarks at the sailors and each other, they reminded one of a swarm of black wasps buzzing about rows of white headstones in a churchyard. Now, there can be little doubt that their being so much among the guns is the very thing that makes a gunner's gang so cross and quarrelsome. Indeed, this was once proved to the satisfaction of our whole company of main-topmen. A fine top-mate of ours, a most merry and companionable fellow, chanced to be promoted to a quarter-gunner's berth. A few days afterward, some of us main-topmen, his old comrades, went to pay him a visit, while he was going his regular rounds through the division of guns allotted to his care. But instead of greeting us with his usual heartiness and cracking his pleasant jokes, to our amazement he did little else but scowl, and at last, when we rallied him upon his ill temper, he seized a long black rammer from overhead and drove us on deck, threatening to report us if we ever dared to be familiar with him again. My top-mates thought that this remarkable metamorphose was the effect produced upon a weak, vain character suddenly elevated from the level of a mere seaman to the dignified position of a petty officer. But though, in similar cases, I had seen such effects produced upon some of the crew, yet, in the present instance, I knew better than that. It was solely brought about by his consorting with those villainous, irritable, ill-tempered cannon, more especially from his being subject to the orders of those deformed blunderbusses, priming and cylinder. The truth seems to be, indeed, that all people should be very careful in selecting their callings and vocations, very careful in seeing to it that they surround themselves by good-humored, pleasant-looking objects and agreeable, temper-soothing sounds. Many an angelic disposition has had its even edge turned and hacked like a saw, and many a sweet draught of piety has soured on the heart from people's choosing ill-natured employments and omitting to gather round them good-natured landscapes. Gardeners are almost always pleasant, affable people to converse with, but beware of quarter-gunners, keepers of arsenals, and lonely lighthouse-men. It would be advisable for any man who, from an unlucky choice of a profession which it is too late to change for another, should find his temper souring, to endeavor to counteract that misfortune by filling his private chamber with amiable, pleasurable sights and sounds. In summer-time, an Aeolian harp can be placed in your window at a very trifling expense. A conch shell might stand on your mantel, to be taken up and held to the ear, that you may be soothed by its continual lulling sound when you feel the blue fit stealing over you. For sights, a gay-painted punch-bowl or Dutch tankard, never mind about filling it, might be recommended. It should be placed on a bracket in the pier. Nor is an old-fashioned silver ladle, nor a chased dinner-caster, nor a fine portly demijohn, nor anything, indeed, that savours of eating and drinking, bad to drive off the spleen. But perhaps the best of all is a shelf of merrily bound books, containing comedies, farces, songs, and humorous novels. You need never open them, only have the titles in plain sight. For this purpose, Peregrine Pickle is a good book, so is Gil Blas, so is Goldsmith. But of all chamber furniture in the world, best calculated to cure a bad temper, and breed a pleasant one, is the sight of a lovely wife. If you have children, however, that are teething, the nursery should be a good way upstairs. At sea, it ought to be in the mizzen-top. Indeed, teething children play the very deuce with a husband's temper. I have known 3 promising young husbands completely spoil on their wives' hands by reason of a teething child, whose worrisomeness happened to be aggravated at the time by the summer complaint. With a breaking heart and my handkerchief to my eyes, I followed those 3 hapless young husbands, one after the other, to their premature graves. Gossiping scenes breed gossips. Who so chatty as hotel clerks, market women, auctioneers, barkeepers, apothecaries, newspaper reporters, monthly nurses, and all those who live in bustling crowds or are present at scenes of chatty interest. Solitude breeds taciturnity. That everybody knows. Who so taciturn as authors taken as a race? A forced interior quietude, in the midst of great outward commotion, breeds moody people. Who so moody as railroad brakemen, steamboat engineers, helmsmen, and tenders of power looms in cotton factories? For all these must hold their peace while employed, and let the machinery do the chatting. They cannot even edge in a single syllable. Now this theory about the wondrous influence of habitual sights and sounds upon the human temper was suggested by my experiences on board our frigate, and although I regard the example furnished by our quarter-gunners, especially him who had once been our top-mate, as by far the strongest argument in favor of the general theory, yet the entire ship abounded with illustrations of its truth. Who were more liberal-hearted, lofty-minded, gayer, more jocund, elastic, adventurous, given to fun and frolic, than the top-men of the fore, main, and mizzen-masts? The reason of their liberal-heartedness was, that they were daily called upon to expatiate themselves all over the rigging. The reason of their lofty-mindedness was, that they were high-lifted above the petty tumults, carping cares, and paltrinesses of the decks below. And I feel persuaded in my inmost soul that it is to the fact of my having been a main-topman, and especially my particular post being on the loftiest yard of the frigate, the main royal yard, that I am now enabled to give such a free, broad, off-hand, bird's-eye, and, more than all, impartial account of our man-of-war world, withholding nothing, inventing nothing, nor flattering nor scandalizing any, but meting out to all, Commodore and messenger boy alike, their precise descriptions and deserts. The reason of the mirthfulness of these topmen was, that they always looked out upon the blue, boundless, dimpled, laughing, sunny sea. Nor do I hold that it militates against this theory, that of a stormy day, when the face of the ocean was black and overcast, that some of them would grow moody, and choose to sit apart. On the contrary, it only proves the thing which I maintain, for even on shore there are many people naturally gay and light-hearted, who, whenever the autumnal wind begins to bluster round the corners, and roar along the chimney-stacks, straight becomes cross, petulant, and irritable. What is more mellow than fine old ale? Yet thunder will sour the best nut-brown ever brewed. The holders of our frigate, the troglodytes, who lived down in the tarry cellars and caves below the berth-deck, were, nearly all of them, men of gloomy dispositions, taking sour views of everything. One of them was a blue-light Calvinist. Whereas the old sheet-anchor men, who spent their time in the bracing sea air and broadcast sunshine of the forecastle, were free, generous-hearted, charitable, and full of good-will to all hands, though some of them, to tell the truth, proved sad exceptions, but exceptions only prove the rule. The steady cooks on the berth-deck, the steady sweepers and steady spit-box musterers in all divisions of the frigate, fore and aft, were a narrow-minded set, with contracted souls, imputable, no doubt, to their grovelling duties. More especially was this evinced in the case of those odious ditchers and night-scavengers, the ignoble wasters. The members of the band, some 10 or 12 in number, who had nothing to do but keep their instruments polished and play a lively air now and then to stir the stagnant current in our poor old Commodore's torpid veins, were the most gleeful set of fellows you ever saw. They were Portuguese, who had been shipped at the Cape de Verde Islands on the passage out. They messed by themselves, forming a dinner party not to be exceeded ire mirthfulness by a club of young bridegrooms 3 months after marriage, completely satisfied with their bargains after testing them. But what made them now so full of fun? What indeed but their merry, martial, mellow calling? Who could be a churl, and play a flageolet? Who mean and spiritless, braying forth the souls of 1,000 heroes from his brazen trump? But still more efficacious, perhaps, in ministering to the light spirits of the band, was the consoling thought that should the ship ever go into action, they would be exempted from the perils of battle. In ships of war, the members of the music, as the band is called, are generally non-combatants, and mostly ship, with the express understanding that, as soon as the vessel comes within long gunshot of an enemy, they shall have the privilege of burrowing down in the cable tiers or sea-coal holes, which shows that they are inglorious but uncommonly sensible fellows. Look at the barons of the gun-room, lieutenants, purser, marine officers, sailing-master, all of them gentlemen with stiff upper lips and aristocratic cut noses. Why was this? Will anyone deny that from their living so long in high military life, served by a crowd of menial stewards and cot-boys, and always accustomed to command right and left, will anyone deny, I say, that by reason of this their very noses had become thin, peaked, aquiline, and aristocratically cartilaginous? Even old Cuticle, the surgeon, had a Roman nose. But I never could account how it came to be that our gray-headed first lieutenant was a little lopsided; that is, one of his shoulders disproportionately dropped; and when I observed that nearly all the first lieutenants I saw in other men of war, besides many second and third lieutenants, were similarly lopsided, I knew that there must be some general law which induced the phenomenon, and I put myself to studying it out, as an interesting problem. At last I came to the conclusion, to which I still adhere, that their so long wearing only one epaulet, for to only one does their rank entitle them, was the infallible clue to this mystery; and when any one reflects upon so well-known a fact, that many sea lieutenants grow decrepit from age, without attaining a captaincy and wearing two epaulets, which would strike the balance between their shoulders, the above reason assigned will not appear unwarrantable. End of Chapter 12. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 13 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 13. A Man-of-War Hermit in a Mob. The allusion to the poet Lemsford in a previous chapter leads me to speak of our mutual friends Nord and Williams, who, with Lemsford himself, Jack Chase, and my comrades of the maintop, comprised almost the only persons with whom I unreservedly consorted while on board the frigate. For I had not been long on board ere I found that it would not do to be intimate with everybody. An indiscriminate intimacy with all hands leads to sundry annoyances and scrapes, too often ending with a dozen at the gangway. Though I was above a year in the frigate, there were scores of men who, to the last, remained perfect strangers to me, whose very names I did not know, and whom I would hardly be able to recognize now should I happen to meet them in the streets. In the dog watches at sea, during the early part of the evening, the main deck is generally filled with crowds of pedestrians, promenading up and down past the guns, like people taking the air in Broadway. At such times it is curious to see the men nodding to each other's recognitions. They might not have seen each other for a week, exchanging a pleasant word with a friend, making a hurried appointment to meet him somewhere aloft on the morrow, or passing group after group without deigning the slightest salutation. Indeed, I was not at all singular in having but comparatively few acquaintances on board, though certainly carrying my fastidiousness to an unusual extent. My friend Nord was a somewhat remarkable character, and if mystery includes romance, he certainly was a very romantic one. Before seeking an introduction to him through Lemsford, I had often marked his tall, spare, upright figure stalking like Don Quixote among the pygmies of the afterguard to which he belonged. At first I found him exceedingly reserved and taciturn. His saturnine brow wore a scowl. He was almost repelling in his demeanor. In a word, he seemed desirous of hinting that his list of man-of-war friends was already made up, complete and full, and there was no room for more. But observing that the only man he ever consorted with was Lemsford, I had too much magnanimity, by going off in a pique at his coldness, to let him lose forever the chance of making so capital an acquaintance as myself. Besides, I saw it in his eye that the man had been a reader of good books. I would have staked my life on it, that he seized the right meaning of Montaigne. I saw that he was an earnest thinker. I more than suspected that he had been bolted in the mill of adversity. For all these things, my heart yearned toward him. I determined to know him. At last I succeeded. It was during a profoundly quiet midnight watch when I perceived him walking alone in the waist, while most of the men were dozing on the carronade slides. That night we scoured all the prairies of reading, dived into the bosoms of authors, and tore out their hearts, and that night White Jacket learned more than he has ever done in any single night since. The man was a marvel. He amazed me as much as Coleridge did the troopers among whom he enlisted. What could have induced such a man to enter a man-of-war, all my sapience cannot fathom. And how he managed to preserve his dignity, as he did, among such a rabble-rout, was equally a mystery. For he was no sailor; as ignorant of a ship, indeed, as a man from the sources of the Niger. Yet the officers respected him, and the men were afraid of him. This much was observable, however, that he faithfully discharged whatever special duties devolved upon him, and was so fortunate as never to render himself liable to a reprimand. Doubtless he took the same view of the thing that another of the crew did, and had early resolved so to conduct himself as never to run the risk of the scourge. And this it must have been, added to whatever incommunicable grief which might have been his, that made this Nord such a wandering recluse, even among our man-of-war mob. Nor could he have long swung his hammock on board, ere he must have found that, to ensure his exemption from that thing which alone affrighted him, he must be content for the most part to turn a man-hater, and socially expatriate himself from many things, which might have rendered his situation more tolerable. Still more, several events that took place must have horrified him, at times, with the thought that, however he might isolate and entomb himself, yet for all this, the improbability of his being overtaken by what he most dreaded never advanced to the infallibility of the impossible. In my intercourse with Nord, he never made allusion to his past career, a subject upon which most high-bred castaways in a man-of-war are very diffuse, relating their adventures at the gaming-table, the recklessness with which they have run through the amplest fortunes in a single season, their almsgivings and gratuities to porters and poor relations, and above all, their youthful indiscretions, and the broken-hearted ladies they have left behind. No such tales had Nord to tell. Concerning the past, he was barred and locked up like the specie vaults of the Bank of England. For anything that dropped from him, none of us could be sure that he had ever existed till now. Altogether, he was a remarkable man. My other friend, Williams, was a thoroughgoing Yankee from Maine, who had been both a peddler and a pedagogue in his day. He had all manner of stories to tell about nice little country frolics, and would run over an endless list of his sweethearts. He was honest, acute, witty, full of mirth and good humor, a laughing philosopher. He was invaluable as a pill against the spleen, and, with the view of extending the advantages of his society to the saturnine Nord, I introduced them to each other, but Nord cut him dead the very same evening, when we sallied out from between the guns for a walk on the main deck. End of Chapter 13. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapters 14 and 15 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 14. A Draught in a Man of War. We were not many days out of port when a rumor was set afloat that dreadfully alarmed many tars. It was this: that, owing to some unprecedented oversight in the purser, or some equally unprecedented remissness in the naval storekeeper at Callao, the frigate's supply of that delectable beverage called grog was well nigh expended. In the American Navy, the law allows 1 gill of spirits per day to every seaman. In 2 portions it is served out just previous to breakfast and dinner. At the roll of the drum, the sailors assemble round a large tub or cask filled with liquid, and, as their names are called off by a midshipman, they step up and regale themselves from a little tin measure called a tot. No high-liver helping himself to Tokay off a well-polished sideboard smacks his lips with more mighty satisfaction than the sailor does over this tot. To many of them, indeed, the thought of their daily tots forms a perpetual perspective of ravishing landscapes, indefinitely receding in the distance. It is their great prospect in life. Take away their grog, and life possesses no further charms for them. It is hardly to be doubted that the controlling inducement which keeps many men in the Navy is the unbounded confidence they have in the ability of the United States government to supply them, regularly and unfailingly, with their daily allowance of this beverage. I have known several forlorn individuals, shipping as landsmen, who have confessed to me that, having contracted a love for ardent spirits, which they could not renounce, and having by their foolish courses been brought into the most abject poverty, insomuch that they could no longer gratify their thirst ashore, they incontinently entered the Navy, regarding it as the asylum for all drunkards, who might there prolong their lives by regular hours and exercise, and twice every day quench their thirst by moderate and undeviating doses. When I once remonstrated with an old toper of a topman about this daily dram-drinking, when I told him it was ruining him, and advised him to stop his grog, and receive the money for it, in addition to his wages as provided by law, he turned about on me, with an irresistibly waggish look, and said, "Give up my grog, and why? Because it is ruining me? No, no, I am a good Christian, White Jacket, and love my enemy too much to drop his acquaintance." It may be readily imagined, therefore, what consternation and dismay pervaded the gun-deck at the first announcement of the tidings that the grog was expended. "The grog gone?" roared an old sheet-anchor man. "Oh, Lord, what a pain in my stomach!" cried a main-topman. "It's worse than the cholera," cried a man of the after-guard. "I'd sooner the water-casks would give out," said a captain of the hold. "Are we ganders and geese, that we can live without grog?" asked a corporal of marines. "Aye, we must now drink with the ducks," cried a quartermaster. "Not a tot left?" groaned a waister. Not a toothful, sighed a holder from the bottom of his boots. Yes, the fatal intelligence proved true. The drum was no longer heard rolling the men to the tub, and deep gloom and dejection fell like a cloud. The ship was like a great city when some terrible calamity has overtaken it. The men stood apart in groups, discussing their woes and mutually condoling. No longer, of still moonlight nights, was the song heard from the giddy tops, and few and far between were the stories that were told. It was during this interval, so dismal to many, that to the amazement of all hands, 10 men were reported by the master-at-arms to be intoxicated. They were brought up to the mast, and at their appearance the doubts of the most skeptical were dissipated. But whence they had obtained their liquor no one could tell. It was observed, however, at the time, that the tarry knaves all smelled of lavender, like so many dandies. After their examination, they were ordered into the brig, a jail-house between 2 guns on the main-deck, where prisoners are kept. Here they laid for some time, stretched out stark and stiff, with their arms folded over their breasts, like so many effigies of the Black Prince on his monument in Canterbury Cathedral. Their first slumbers over, the marine sentry who stood guard over them had as much as he could do to keep off the crowd, who were all eagerness to find out how, in such a time of want, the prisoners had managed to drink themselves into oblivion. In due time they were liberated, and the secret simultaneously leaked out. It seemed that an enterprising man of their number, who had suffered severely from the common deprivation, had all at once been struck by a brilliant idea. It had come to his knowledge that the purser's steward was supplied with a large quantity of eau de Cologne, clandestinely brought out in the ship for the purpose of selling it on his own account, to the people of the coast. But the supply proving larger than the demand, and having no customers on board the frigate but Lieutenant Selvagee, he was now carrying home more than 1/3 of his original stock. To make a short story of it, this functionary, being called upon in secret, was readily prevailed upon to part with 12 bottles, with whose contents the intoxicated party had regaled themselves. The news spread far and wide among the men, being only kept secret from the officers and underlings, and that night the long, crane-necked cologne bottles jingled in out-of-the-way corners and by-places, and, being emptied, were sent flying out of the ports, with brown sugar taken from the mess chests, and hot water begged from the galley cooks. The men made all manner of punches, toddies, and cocktails, letting fall therein a small drop of tar, like a bit of brown toast, by way of imparting a flavor. Of course, the thing was managed with the utmost secrecy, and as a whole dark night elapsed after their orgies, the revellers were, in a good measure, secure from detection, and those who indulged too freely had 12 long hours to get sober before daylight obtruded. Next day, fore and aft, the whole frigate smelled like a lady's toilette. The very tar-buckets were fragrant, and from the mouth of many a grim, grizzled old quarter-gunner came the most fragrant of breaths. The amazed lieutenants went about snuffing up the gale, and for once, Selvagee had no further need to flourish his perfumed handkerchief. It was as if we were sailing by some odoriferous shore in the vernal season of violets. Sabine odeur. For many a league, cheered with grateful smell, old ocean smiled. But alas, all this perfume could not be wasted for nothing, and the masters-at-arms and ship's corporals, putting this and that together, very soon burrowed into the secret. The purser's steward was called to account, and no more lavender punches and cologne toddies were drank on board the Neversink. End of Chapter 14. Chapter 15. A Salt Junk Club in a Man of War with a Notice to Quit. It was about the period of the Cologne water excitement that my self-conceit was not a little wounded, and my sense of delicacy altogether shocked by a polite hint received from the cook of the mess to which I happened to belong. To understand the matter, it is needful to enter into preliminaries. The common seamen, in a large frigate, are divided into some 30 or 40 messes, put down on the purser's books as mess number 1, mess number 2, mess number 3, etc. The members of each mess club, their rations of provisions and breakfast dine and sup together in allotted intervals between the guns on the main deck. In undeviating rotation, the members of each mess, excepting the petty officers, take their turn in performing the functions of cook and steward, and for the time being, all the affairs of the club are subject to their inspection and control. It is the cook's business, also, to have an eye to the general interests of his mess, to see that, when the aggregated allowances of beef, bread, etc., are served out by one of the master's mates, the mess over which he presides receives its full share, without stint or subtraction. Upon the berth deck he has a chest, in which to keep his pots, pans, spoons, and small stores of sugar, molasses, tea, and flour. But though entitled a cook, strictly speaking, the head of the mess is no cook at all, for the cooking for the crew is all done by a high and mighty functionary, officially called the ship's cook, assisted by several deputies. In our frigate, this personage was a dignified colored gentleman, whom the men dubbed Old Coffee, and his assistants, negroes also, went by the poetical appellations of Sunshine, Rosewater, and Mayday. Now, the ship's cooking required very little science, though Old Coffee often assured us that he had graduated at the New York Astor House, under the immediate eye of the celebrated Coleman and Stetson. All he had to do was, in the first place, to keep bright and clean the 3 huge coppers, or cauldrons, in which many 100 pounds of beef were daily boiled. To this end, Rosewater, Sunshine, and Mayday every morning sprang into their respective apartments, stripped to the waist and well provided with bits of soapstone and sand. By exercising these in a very vigorous manner, they threw themselves into a violent perspiration, and put a fine polish upon the interior of the coppers. Sunshine was the bard of the trio, and while all 3 would be busily employed clattering their soapstones against the metal, he would exhilarate them with some remarkable St. Domingo melodies, one of which was the following: "Oh, I lost my shoe in an old canoe, Johnny-O, come win 'em so. Oh, I lost my boot in a pilot boat, Johnny-O, come win 'em so. Den rub-a-dub de copper-o, oh, copper rub-a-dub-a-o." When I listened to these jolly Africans, thus making gleeful their toil by their cheering songs, I could not help murmuring against that immemorable rule of men of war, which forbids the sailors to sing out, as in merchant vessels, when pulling ropes, or occupied at any other ship's duty. Your only music, at such times, is the shrill pipe of the boatswain's mate, which is almost worse than no music at all. And if the boatswain's mate is not by, you must pull the ropes, like convicts, in profound silence, or else endeavor to impart unity to the exertions of all hands, by singing out mechanically 1, 2, 3, and then pulling all together. Now, when Sunshine, Rosewater, and Mayday have so polished the ship's coppers that a white kid glove might be drawn along the inside and show no stain, they leap out of their holes, and the water is poured in for the coffee. And the coffee being boiled and decanted off in bucketfuls, the cooks of the messes march up with their salt beef for dinner, strung upon strings and tallied with labels, all of which are plunged together into the self-same coppers and there boiled. when upon the beef being fished out with a huge pitchfork, the water for the evening's tea is poured in, which, consequently possesses a flavor not unlike that of shank soup. From this, it will be seen that, so far as cooking is concerned, a cook of the mess has very little to do, merely carrying his provisions to and from the grand democratic cookery. Still, in some things, his office involves many annoyances. Twice a week, butter and cheese are served out, so much to each man, and the mess cook has the sole charge of these delicacies. The great difficulty consists in so catering for the mess, touching these luxuries, as to satisfy all. Some guzzlers are for devouring the butter at a meal, and finishing off with the cheese the same day. Others contend for saving it up against Banyan Day, when there is nothing but beef and bread. And others, again, are for taking a very small bit of butter and cheese by way of dessert, to each and every meal through the week. All this gives rise to endless disputes, debates, and altercations. Sometimes, with his mess cloth, a square of painted canvas, set out on deck between the guns, garnished with pots and pans and kids, you see the mess cook seated on a match-tub at its head, his trouser legs rolled up and arms bared, presiding over the convivial party. "Now, men, you can't have any butter today. I'm saving it up for tomorrow. You don't know the value of butter, men. You, Jim, take your hoof off the cloth. Devil take me if some of you chaps haven't no more manners than so many swines. Quick, men, quick, bear a hand and scoff. Eat. Away. I've got my tomorrow's duff to make yet, and some of you fellows keep scoffing as if I had nothing to do but sit still here on this here tub here and look on. There, there, men, you've all had enough, so sail away out of this and let me clear up the wreck." In this strain would one of the periodical cooks of mess number 15 talk to us. He was a tall, resolute fellow, who had once been a brakeman on a railroad, and he kept us all pretty straight. From his fiat there was no appeal. But it was not thus when the turn came to others among us. Then it was look out for squalls. The business of dining became a bore, and digestion was seriously impaired by the unamiable discourse we had over our salt horse. I sometimes thought that the junks of lean pork, which were boiled in their own bristles, and looked gaunt and grim like pickled chins of half-famished, unwashed Cossacks, had something to do with creating the bristling bitterness at times prevailing in our mess. The men tore off the tough hide from their pork as if they were Indians scalping Christians. Some cursed the cook for a rogue who kept from us our butter and cheese, in order to make away with it himself in an underhand manner, selling it at a premium to other messes, and thus accumulating a princely fortune at our expense. Others anathematized him for his slovenliness, casting hypercritical glances into their pots and pans, and scraping them with their knives. Then he would be railed at for his miserable duffs, and other shortcoming preparations. Marking all this from the beginning, I, White Jacket, was sorely troubled with the idea that, in the course of time, my own turn would come around to undergo the same objurgations. How to escape, I knew not. However, when the dreaded period arrived, I received the keys of office, the keys of the mess chest, with a resigned temper, and offered up a devout ejaculation of fortitude under the trial. I resolved, please Heaven, to approve myself an unexceptionable caterer, and the most impartial of stewards. The first day there was duff to make, a business which devolved upon the mess cooks, though the boiling of it pertained to old Coffee and his deputies. I made up my mind to lay myself out on that duff, to centre all my energies upon it, to put the very soul of art into it, and achieve an unrivalled duff, a duff that should put out of conceit all other duffs, and forever make my administration memorable. From the proper functionary the flour was obtained, and the raisins, the beef fat or slush from old coffee, and the requisite supply of water from the scuttlebutt. I then went among the various cooks to compare their receipts for making duffs, and having well weighed them all, and gathered from each a choice item to make an original receipt of my own, with due deliberation and solemnity I proceeded to business. Placing the component parts in a tin pan, I kneaded them together for an hour, entirely reckless as to pulmonary considerations, touching the ruinous expenditure of breath, and having decanted the semi-liquid dough into a canvas bag, secured the muzzle, tied on the tally, and delivered it to Rosewater, who dropped the precious bag into the coppers, along with a score or two of others. 8 bells had struck. The boatswain and his mates had piped the hands to dinner. My mess-cloth was set out, and my messmates were assembled, knife in hand, all ready to precipitate themselves upon the devoted duff. Waiting at the grand cookery till my turn came, I received the bag of pudding, and gallanting it into the mess, proceeded to loosen the string. It was an anxious, I may say, a fearful moment. My hands trembled, every eye was upon me, my reputation and credit were at stake. Slowly I undressed the duff, dandling it upon my knee, much as a nurse does a baby about bedtime. The excitement increased as I curled down the bag from the pudding. It became intense when at last I plumped it into the pan, held up to receive it by an eager hand. Bim! It fell like a man shot down in a riot. Distraction! It was harder than a sinner's heart, yea, tough as the cock that crowed on the morn that Peter told a lie. Gentlemen of the mess, for heaven's sake, permit me one word. I have done my duty by that duff, I have. But they beat down my excuses with a storm of criminations. One present proposed that the fatal pudding should be tied around my neck, like a millstone, and myself pushed overboard. No use, no use, I had failed. Ever after, that duff lay heavy at my stomach and my heart. After this I grew desperate, despised popularity, returned scorn for scorn, till at length my week expired, and in the duff bag I transferred the keys of office to the next man on the roll. Somehow there had never been a very cordial feeling between this mess and me. All along they had nourished a prejudice against my white jacket. They must have harbored the silly fancy that in it I gave myself airs, and wore it in order to look consequential, perhaps as a cloak to cover pilferings of tit-bits from the mess. But to out with the plain truth, they themselves were not a very irreproachable set. Considering the sequel I am coming to, this avowal may be deemed sheer malice, but for all that, I cannot avoid speaking my mind. After my week of office, the mess gradually changed their behavior to me. They cut me to the heart. They became cold and reserved, seldom or never addressed me at meal times without invidious allusions to my duff, and also to my jacket, and its dripping in wet weather upon the mess-cloth. However, I had no idea that anything serious on their part was brewing, but alas, so it turned out. We were assembled at supper one evening when I noticed certain winks and silent hints tipped to the cook who presided. He was a little oily fellow, who had once kept an oyster-cellar ashore. He bore me a grudge. Looking down on the mess-cloth, he observed that some fellows never knew when their room was better than their company. This being a maxim of indiscriminate application, of course I silently assented to it, as any other reasonable man would have done, but this remark was followed up by another, to the effect that not only did some fellows never know when their room was better than their company, but they persisted in staying when their company wasn't wanted, and by so doing disturbed the serenity of society at large. But this also was a general observation that could not be gainsaid. A long and ominous pause ensued, during which I perceived every eye upon me and my white jacket. while the cook went on to enlarge upon the disagreeableness of a perpetually damp garment in the mess, especially when that garment was white. This was coming nearer home. Yes, they were going to blackball me, but I resolved to sit it out a little longer, never dreaming that my moralist would proceed to extremities, while all hands were present. But bethinking him that by going this roundabout way he would never get at his object, he went off on another tack, apprising me, in substance, that he was instructed by the whole mess, then and there assembled, to give me warning to seek out another club, as they did not longer fancy the society either of myself or my jacket. I was shocked. Such a want of tact and delicacy, common propriety, suggested that a point-blank intimation of that nature should be conveyed in a private interview, or, still better, by note. I immediately rose, tucked my jacket about me, bowed, and departed. And now, to do myself justice, I must add that, the next day, I was received with open arms by a glorious set of fellows, Mess No. 1, numbering, among the rest, my noble Captain Jack Chase. This mess was principally composed of the headmost men of the gun-deck, and, out of a pardonable self-conceit, they called themselves the 42-pounder Club, meaning that they were, one and all, fellows of large intellectual and corporeal caliber. Their mess-cloth was well located. On their starboard hand was Mess No. 2, embracing sundry rare jokers and high-livers, who waxed gay and epicurean over their salt fare, and were known as the Society for the Destruction of Beef and Pork. On the larboard hand was Mess No. 31, made up entirely of foretopmen, a dashing, blaze-away set of men-of-war's men, who called themselves the Cape Horn Snorters and Neversink Invincibles. Opposite was one of the marine messes, mustering the aristocracy of the Marine Corps, the two corporals, the drummer and fifer, and some 6 or 8 rather gentlemanly privates, native-born Americans who had served in the Seminole campaigns of Florida. And they now enlivened their salt fare with stories of wild ambushes in the Everglades, and one of them related a surprising tale of his hand-to-hand encounter with Osceola, the Indian chief, whom he fought one morning from daybreak till breakfast time. This slashing private also boasted that he could take a chip from between your teeth at 20 paces. He offered to bet any amount on it, and as he could get no one to hold the chip, his boast remained forever good. Besides many other attractions which the 42-pounder Club furnished, it had this one special advantage, that, owing to there being so many petty officers in it, all the members of the mess were exempt from doing duty as cooks and stewards. A fellow called a steady cook attended to that business during the entire cruise. He was a long, lank, pallid varlet, going by the name of Shanks. In very warm weather, this Shanks would sit at the foot of the mess-cloth, fanning himself with the front flap of his frock or shirt, which he inelegantly wore over his trousers. Jack Chase, the president of the club, frequently remonstrated against this breach of good manners. But the steady cook had somehow contracted the habit, and it proved incurable. For a time, Jack Chase, out of a polite nervousness touching myself as a newly elected member of the club, would frequently endeavor to excuse to me the vulgarity of Shanks. One day he wound up his remarks by the philosophic reflection, "But, White Jacket, my dear fellow, what can you expect of him? Our real misfortune is, that our noble club should be obliged to dine with its cook." There were several of these steady cooks on board, men of no mark or consideration whatever in the ship, lost to all noble promptings, sighing for no worlds to conquer, and perfectly contented with mixing their duffs, and spreading their mess-cloths, and mustering their pots and pans together 3 times every day for a 3 years' cruise. They were very seldom to be seen on the spar-deck, but kept below, out of sight. End of chapters 14 and 15. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 16 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 16. General Training in a Man of War. To a quiet, contemplative character, averse to uproar, undue exercise of his bodily members, and all kind of useless confusion, nothing can be more distressing than a proceeding in all men of war called general quarters. And well may it be so called, since it amounts to a general drawing and quartering of all the parties concerned. As the specific object for which a man of war is built and put into commission is to fight and fire off cannon, it is, of course, deemed indispensable that the crew should be duly instructed in the art and mystery involved. Hence these general quarters, which is a mustering of all hands to their stations at the guns on the several decks, and a sort of sham fight with an imaginary foe. The summons is given by the ship's drummer, who strikes a peculiar beat, short, broken, rolling, shuffling, like the sound made by the march into battle of iron-heeled grenadiers. It is a regular tune, with a fine song composed to it. The words of the chorus, being most artistically arranged, may give some idea of the air. Hearts of oak are our ships, jolly tars are our men. We always are ready, steady, boys, steady, to fight and to conquer again and again. In warm weather this pastime at the guns is exceedingly unpleasant, to say the least, and throws a quiet man into a violent passion and perspiration. For one, I ever abominated it. I have a heart like Julius Caesar, and upon occasions would fight like Caius Marcius Coriolanus. If my beloved and forever glorious country should be ever in jeopardy from invaders, let Congress put me on a war horse in the vanguard, and then see how I will acquit myself. But to toil and sweat in a fictitious encounter, to squander the precious breath of my precious body in a ridiculous fight of shams and pretensions, to hurry about the deck pretending to carry the killed and wounded below, to be told that I must consider the ship blowing up in order to exercise myself in presence of mind, and prepare for a real explosion, all this I despise, as beneath a true tar and man of valor. These were my sentiments at the time, and these remain my sentiments still. But as, while on board the frigate, my liberty of thought did not extend to liberty of expression, I was obliged to keep these sentiments to myself, though, indeed, I had some thoughts of addressing a letter, marked private and confidential, to his honor the Commodore on the subject. My station at the batteries was at one of the 32-pound carronades on the starboard side of the quarter-deck. Footnote 1. For the benefit of a Quaker reader here and there, a word or two in explanation of a carronade may not be amiss. The carronade is a gun comparatively short and light for its caliber. A carronade throwing a 32-pound shot weighs considerably less than a long gun only throwing a 24-pound shot. It further differs from a long gun in working with a joint and bolt underneath, instead of the short arms or trunnions at the sides. Its carriage, likewise, is quite different from that of a long gun, having a sort of sliding apparatus, something like an extension dining table. The goose on it, however, is a tough one, and villainously stuffed with most indigestible dumplings. Point blank, The range of a carronade does not exceed 150 yards, much less than the range of a long gun. When of large caliber, however, it throws within that limit paysan shot all manner of shells and combustibles with great effect, being a very destructive engine at close quarters. This piece is now very generally found mounted in the batteries of the English and American navies. The quarter-deck armaments of most modern frigates wholly consist of carronades. The name is derived from the village of Carron in Scotland, at whose celebrated foundries this iron Attila was first cast. I did not fancy this station at all, for it is well known on shipboard that, in time of action, the quarter-deck is one of the most dangerous posts of a man of war. The reason is, that the officers of the highest rank are there stationed, and the enemy have an ungentlemanly way of target shooting at their buttons. If we should chance to engage a ship, then who could tell but some bungling small-arm marksman in the enemy's tops might put a bullet through me instead of the Commodore? If they hit him, no doubt he would not feel it much, for he was used to that sort of thing, and, indeed, had a bullet in him already, whereas I was altogether unaccustomed to having blue pills playing round my head in such an indiscriminate way. Besides, ours was a flagship, and every one knows what a peculiarly dangerous predicament the quarter-deck of Nelson's flagship was in at the Battle of Trafalgar, how the lofty tops of the enemy were full of soldiers, peppering away at the English admiral and his officers. Many a poor sailor, at the guns of that quarter-deck, must have received a bullet intended for some wearer of an epaulet. By candidly confessing my feelings on this subject, I do by no means invalidate my claims to being held a man of prodigious valor. I merely state my invincible repugnance to being shot for somebody else. If I am shot, be it with the express understanding in the shooter that I am the identical person intended so to be served. That Thracian who, with his compliments, sent an arrow into the king of Macedon, superscribed for Philip's right eye, set a fine example to all warriors. The hurried, hasty, indiscriminate, reckless, abandoned manner in which both sailors and soldiers nowadays fight is really painful to any serious-minded, methodical old gentleman, especially if he chance to have systematized his mind as an accountant. There is little or no skill and bravery about it. Two parties, armed with lead and old iron, envelop themselves in a cloud of smoke, and pitch their lead and old iron about in all directions. If you happen to be in the way, you are hit, possibly killed. If not, you escape. In sea actions, if by good or bad luck, as the case may be, a round shot, fired at random through the smoke, happens to send overboard your foremast, another to unship your rudder, there you lie crippled, pretty much at the mercy of your foe, who accordingly pronounces himself victor, though that honor properly belongs to the law of gravitation, operating on the enemy's balls in the smoke. Instead of tossing this old lead and iron into the air, therefore, it would be much better amicably to toss up a copper and let heads win. The carronade at which I was stationed was known as Gun No. 5 on the First Lieutenant's quarter-bill. Among our gun's crew, however, it was known as Black Bet. This name was bestowed by the captain of the gun, a fine negro, in honor of his sweetheart, a colored lady of Philadelphia. Of Black Bet I was rammer and sponger, and ram and sponge I did, like a good fellow. I have no doubt that, had I and my gun been at the Battle of the Nile, we would mutually have immortalized ourselves. The ramming pole would have been hung up in Westminster Abbey, and I, ennobled by the King, besides receiving the illustrious honor of an autographed letter from His Majesty through the perfumed right hand of his private secretary. But it was terrible work to help run in and out of the port-hole that amazing mass of metal. especially as the thing must be clone in a trice. Then, at the summons of a horrid rasping rattle, swayed by the captain in person, we were made to rush from our guns, seize pikes and pistols, and repel an imaginary army of boarders, who, by a fiction of the officers, were supposed to be assailing all sides of the ship at once. After cutting and slashing at them a while, we jumped back to our guns, and again went to jerking our elbows. Meantime, a loud cry is heard of "Fire! Fire! Fire!" in the foretop, and a regular engine, worked by a set of Bowery boy tars, is forthwith set to playing streams of water aloft, and now it is "Fire! Fire! Fire!" on the main deck, and the entire ship is in as great a commotion as if a whole city ward were in a blaze. Are our officers of the Navy utterly unacquainted with the laws of good health? Do they not know that this violent exercise taking place just after a hearty dinner, as it generally does, is eminently calculated to breed the dyspepsia? There was no satisfaction in dining. The flavor of every mouthful was destroyed by the thought that the next moment the cannonading drum might be beating to quarters. Such a sea martinet was our captain, that sometimes we were roused from our hammocks at night, when a scene would ensue that it is not in the power of pen and ink to describe. 500 men spring to their feet, dress themselves, take up their bedding, and run to the nettings and stow it. Then he to their stations, each man jostling his neighbor, some alow, some aloft, some this way, some that, and in less than 5 minutes the frigate is ready for action, and still as the grave. Almost every man precisely where he would be were an enemy actually about to be engaged. The gunner, like a Cornwall miner in a cave, is burrowing down in the magazine under the ward-room, which is lighted by battle lanterns, placed behind glazed glass bull's-eyes inserted in the bulkhead. The powder monkeys, or boys who fetch and carry cartridges, are scampering to and fro among the guns, and the first and second loaders stand ready to receive their supplies. These powder monkeys, as they are called, enact a curious part in time of action. The entrance to the magazine on the berth deck, where they procure their food for the guns, is guarded by a woolen screen, and a gunner's mate, standing behind it, thrusts out the cartridges through a small arm-hole in this screen. The enemy's shot, perhaps red-hot, are flying in all directions, and to protect their cartridges, the powder monkeys hurriedly wrap them up in their jackets, and with all haste scramble up the ladders to their respective guns, like eating-house waiters hurrying along with hot cakes for breakfast. At general quarters, the shot-boxes are uncovered, showing the grape shot, aptly so called, for they precisely resemble bunches of the fruit, though to receive a bunch of iron grapes in the abdomen would be but a sorry dessert, and also showing the canister shot, old iron of various sorts, packed in a tin case, like a tea-caddy. Imagine some midnight craft sailing down on her enemy thus, 24-pounders leveled, matches lighted, and each captain of his gun at his post. But if verily going into action, then would the Neversink have made still further preparations. For however alike in some things, there is always a vast difference, if you sound them, between a reality and a sham. Not to speak of the pale sternness of the men at their guns at such a juncture, and the choked thoughts at their hearts, the ship itself would here and there present a far different appearance. Something like that of an extensive mansion preparing for a grand entertainment, when folding doors are withdrawn, chambers converted into drawing-rooms, and every inch of available space thrown into one continuous whole. For previous to an action, every bulkhead in a man-of-war is knocked down, great guns are run out of the Commodore's parlor windows, nothing separates the wardroom officers' quarters from those of the men, but an ensign used for a curtain. The sailors' mess chests are tumbled down into the hold, and the hospital cots, of which all men of war carry a large supply, are dragged forth from the sail room, and piled near at hand to receive the wounded. Amputation tables are ranged in the cockpit or in the tiers, whereon to carve the bodies of the maimed. The yards are slung in chains, fire screens distributed here and there, hillocks of cannon balls piled between the guns, shot plugs suspended within easy reach from the beams, and solid masses of wads, big as Dutch cheeses, braced to the cheeks of the gun carriages. No small difference, also, would be visible in the wardrobe of both officers and men. The officers generally fight as dandies dance, namely, in silk stockings. Inasmuch as, in case of being wounded in the leg, the silk hose can be more easily drawn off by the surgeon. Cotton sticks, and works into the wound. An economical captain, while taking care to case his legs in silk, might yet see fit to save his best suit, and fight in his old clothes. For, besides that an old garment might much better be cut to pieces than a new one, it must be a mighty disagreeable thing to die in a stiff, tight-breasted coat, not yet worked easy under the armpits. At such times a man should feel free, unencumbered, and perfectly at ease in point of straps and suspenders. No ill will concerning his tailor should intrude upon his thoughts of eternity. Seneca understood this, when he chose to die naked in a bath, and men of war's men understand it also, for most of them, in battle, stripped to the waistbands, wearing nothing but a pair of duck trousers and a handkerchief round their head. A captain, combining a heedful patriotism with economy, would probably bend his old topsails before going into battle, instead of exposing his best canvas to be riddled to pieces. For it is generally the case that the enemy's shot flies high, unless allowance is made for it in pointing the tube at long gun distance. The slightest roll of the ship, at the time of firing, would send a shot meant for the hull high over the top-gallant yards. But besides these differences between a sham fight at general quarters and a real cannonading, the aspect of the ship, at the beating of the retreat, would, in the latter case, be very dissimilar to the neatness and uniformity in the former. Then our bulwarks might look like the walls of the houses in West Broadway in New York, after being broken into and burned out by the negro mob. Our stout masts and yards might be lying about decks like tree boughs after a tornado in a piece of woodland. Our dangling ropes, cut and sundered in all directions, would be bleeding tar at every yard, and strew with jagged splinters from our wounded planks, the gun-deck might resemble a carpenter's shop. Then, when all was over, and all hands would be piped to take down the hammocks from the exposed nettings, where they play the part of the cotton bales at New Orleans, we might find bits of broken shot, iron bolts, and bullets in our blankets. And, while smeared with blood like butchers, the surgeon and his mates would be amputating arms and legs on the berth-deck, an underling of the carpenter's gang would be new-legging and arming the broken chairs and tables in the Commodore's cabin, while the rest of his squad would be splicing and fishing the shattered masts and yards. The scupper holes having discharged the last rivulet of blood, the decks would be washed down, and the galley cooks would be going fore and aft, sprinkling them with hot vinegar, to take out the shambles smell from the planks, which, unless some such means are employed, often create a highly offensive effluvia for weeks after a fight. Then, upon mustering the men and calling the quarter-bills by the light of a battle-lantern, many a wounded seaman, with his arm in a sling, would answer for some poor shipmate who could never more make answer for himself. "Tom Brown." "Killed, sir." "Jack Jewell." "Killed, sir." "Joe Hardy." "Killed, sir." and opposite all these poor fellows' names, down would go on the quarter bills the bloody marks of red ink, a murderer's fluid, fitly used on these occasions. End of chapter 16. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 17 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 17. Away, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Cutters, away. It was the morning succeeding one of these general quarters that we picked up a life buoy descried floating by. It was a circular mass of cork, about 8 inches thick and 4 feet in diameter, covered with tarred canvas. All round its circumference there trailed a number of knotted ropes' ends, terminating in fanciful Turks' heads. These were the lifelines for the drowning to clutch. Inserted into the middle of the cork was an upright, carved pole, somewhat shorter than a pike-staff. The whole buoy was embossed with barnacles, and its sides festooned with seaweeds. Dolphins were sporting and flashing around it, and one white bird was hovering over the top of the pole. Long ago this thing must have been thrown overboard to save some poor wretch who must have been drowned, while even the life buoy itself had drifted away out of sight. The forecastle men fished it up from the bows, and the seamen thronged round it. "Bad luck, bad luck!" cried the captain of the head. "We'll number one less before long." The ship's cooper strolled by, he to whose department it belongs to see that the ship's life buoys are kept in good order. In men of war, night and day, week in and week out, 2 life buoys are kept depending from the stern, and 2 men, with hatchets in their hands, pace up and down, ready at the first cry to cut the cord and drop the buoys overboard. Every 2 hours they are regularly relieved, like sentinels on guard. No similar precautions are adopted in the merchant or whaling service. Thus deeply solicitous to preserve human life are the regulations of men of war, and seldom has there been a better illustration of this solicitude than at the Battle of Trafalgar, when, after several thousand French seamen had been destroyed, according to Lord Collingwood, and, by the official returns, 1,690 Englishmen were killed or wounded. The captains of the surviving ships ordered the life buoys' sentries from their death-dealing guns to their vigilant posts, as officers of the Humane Society. "There, Bungs!" cried Scrimmage, a sheet anchorman. "There's a good pattern for you. Make us a brace of life buoys like that. Something that will save a man, and not fill and sink under him, as those leaky quarter-casks of yours will the first time there's occasion to drop her'n. I came near pitching off the bowsprit the other day, and when I scrambled inboard again I went aft to get a squint at 'em. Why, Bungs, they are all open between the staves. Shame on you! Suppose you yourself should fall overboard, and find yourself going down with buoys under you of your own making. What then?" Footnote: in addition to the bower anchors carried on her bows, a frigate carries large anchors in her forechains, called sheet anchors. Hence the old seamen stationed in that part of a man of war are called sheet anchormen. "I never go aloft, and don't intend to fall overboard," replied Bungs. "Don't believe it," cried the sheet anchorman. "You lopers that live about the decks here are nearer the bottom of the sea than the light hand that looses the main royal. Mind your eye, Bungs, mind your eye." "I will," retorted Bungs, "and you mind yours." Next day, just at dawn, I was startled from my hammock by the cry of "All hands about ship and shorten sail!" Springing up the ladders, I found that an unknown man had fallen overboard from the chains, and darting a glance toward the poop, perceived from their gestures that the life sentries there had cut away the buoys. It was blowing a fresh breeze. The frigate was going fast through the water, but the 1,000 arms of 500 men soon tossed her about on the other tack, and checked her further headway. "Do you see him?" shouted the officer of the watch through his trumpet, hailing the main-mastman. "Man or buoy, do you see either?" "See nothing, sir," was the reply. "Clear away the cutters," was the next order. "Bugler, call away the second, third, and fourth cutters' crews. Hands by the tackles." In less than 3 minutes the 3 boats were down. More hands were wanted in one of them, and, among others, I jumped in to make up the deficiency. "Now, men, give way, and each man look out along his oar, and look sharp," cried the officer of our boat. For a time, in perfect silence, we slid up and down the great seething swells of the sea, but saw nothing. "There, it's no use," cried the officer. "He's gone, whoever he is. Pull away, men, pull away. They'll be recalling us soon." "Let him drown," cried the strokesman. "He spoiled my watch below for me." "Who the devil is he?" cried another. "He's one who'll never have a coffin," replied a third. "No, no, they'll never sing out 'All hands bury the dead' for him, my hearties," cried a fourth. "Silence," said the officer, "and look along your oars." But the 16 oarsmen still continued their talk, and, after pulling about for 2 or 3 hours, we spied the recall signal at the frigate's fore-to-gallant mast-head, and returned on board, having seen no sign even of the life buoys. The boats were hoisted up, the yards braced forward, and away we bowled, 1 man less. "Muster all hands," was now the order, when, upon calling the roll, the cooper was the only man missing. "I told you so, men," cried the captain of the head. "I said we would lose a man before long." "Bungs, is it?" cried Scrimmage, the sheet anchorman. "I told him his buoys wouldn't save a drowning man, and now he has proved it." End of Chapter 17. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 18 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 18. A Man of War, Full as a Nut. It was necessary to supply the lost cooper's place. Accordingly, word was passed for all who belonged to that calling to muster at the mainmast, in order that one of them might be selected. 13 men obeyed the summons, a circumstance illustrative of the fact that many good handicraftsmen are lost to their trades and the world by serving in men of war. Indeed, from a frigate's crew might be culled out men of all callings and vocations, from a backslidden parson to a broken-down comedian. The Navy is the asylum for the perverse, the home of the unfortunate. Here the sons of adversity meet the children of calamity, and here the children of calamity meet the offspring of sin. Bankrupt brokers, boot-blacks, blacklegs, and blacksmiths here assemble together, and castaway tinkers, watchmakers, quill-drivers, cobblers, doctors, farmers, and lawyers compare past experiences and talk of old times. Wrecked on a desert shore, a man-of-war's crew could quickly found an Alexandria by themselves, and fill it with all the things which go to make a capital. Frequently, at one and the same time, you see every trade in operation on the gun deck: coopering, carpentering, tailoring, tinkering, blacksmithing, rope-making, preaching, gambling, and fortune-telling. In truth, a man-of-war is a city afloat, with long avenues set out with guns instead of trees, and numerous shady lanes, courts, and byways. The quarter-deck is a grand square, park, or parade ground, with a great Pittsfield elm in the shape of the mainmast at one end, and fronted at the other by the palace of the Commodore's cabin. Or rather, a man-of-war is a lofty, walled, and garrisoned town, like Quebec, where the thoroughfares, and mostly ramparts, and peaceable citizens meet armed sentries at every corner. Or it is like the lodging-houses in Paris, turned upside down, the first floor or deck being rented by a lord, the second by a select club of gentlemen, the third by crowds of artisans, and the fourth by a whole rabble of common people. For even thus is it in a frigate, where the commander has a whole cabin to himself and the spar-deck, the lieutenants their wardroom underneath, and the mass of sailors swing their hammocks under all. And with its long rows of port-hole casements, each revealing the muzzle of a cannon, a man-of-war resembles a three-story house in a suspicious part of the town, with a basement of indefinite depth, and ugly-looking fellows gazing out at the windows. End of Chapter 18. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 19 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 19. The Jacket Aloft. Again must I call attention to my white jacket, which about this time came near being the death of me. I am of a meditative humor, and at sea used often to mount aloft at night, and seating myself on one of the upper yards, tuck my jacket about me, and give loose to reflection. In some ships in which I have done this, the sailors used to fancy that I must be studying astronomy, which indeed to some extent was the case, and that my object in mounting aloft was to get a nearer view of the stars, supposing me, of course, to be short-sighted. A very silly conceit of theirs, some may say, but not so silly after all, for surely the advantage of getting nearer an object by 200 feet is not to be underrated. Then, to study the stars upon the wide, boundless sea is divine as it was to the Chaldean Magi, who observed their revolutions from the plains. And it is a very fine feeling, and one that fuses us into the universe of things, and mates us a part of the all, to think that wherever we ocean wanderers rove, we have still the same glorious old stars to keep us company, that they still shine onward and on, forever beautiful and bright, and luring us by every ray to die and be glorified with them. Aye, aye, we sailors sail not in vain. We expatriate ourselves to nationalize with the universe, and in all our voyages round the world we are still accompanied by those old circumnavigators, the stars, who are shipmates and fellow sailors of ours, sailing in heaven's blue as we on the azure main. Let genteel generations scoff at our hardened hands and fingernails tipped with tar. Did they ever clasp truer palms than ours? Let them feel of our sturdy hearts beating like sledge-hammers in those hot smithies, our bosoms. With their amber-headed canes, let them feel of our generous pulses, and swear that they go off like 32-pounders. Oh, give me again the rover's life, the joy, the thrill, the whirl. Let me feel thee again, old sea, let me leap into thy saddle once more. I am sick of these terra firma toils and cares, sick of the dust and reek of towns. Let me hear the clatter of hailstones on icebergs, and not the dull tramp of these plodders, plodding their dull way from their cradles to their graves. Let me snuff thee up, sea breeze, and whinny in thy spray. Forbid it, sea gods. Intercede for me with Neptune, O sweet Amphitrite, that no dull clod may fall on my coffin. Be mine the tomb that swallowed up Pharaoh and all his hosts. Let me lie down with Drake where he sleeps in the sea. But when White Jacket speaks of the rover's life, he means not life in a man of war, which, with its martial formalities and thousand vices, stabs to the heart the soul of all free and easy honorable rovers. I have said that I was wont to mount up aloft and muse, and thus was it with me the night following the loss of the Cooper. Ere my watch in the top had expired, high up on the main royal yard, I reclined, the white jacket folded around me like Sir John Moore in his frosted cloak. 8 bells had struck, and my watchmates had hied to their hammocks, and the other watch had gone to their stations. And the top, below me, was full of strangers, and still 100 feet above even them I lay entranced, now dozing, now dreaming, now thinking of things past, and anon of the life to come. Well timed was the latter thought, for the life to come was much nearer overtaking me than I then could imagine. Perhaps I was half conscious, at last, of a tremulous voice hailing the main royal yard from the top. But if so, the consciousness glided away from me, and left me in Lethe. But when, like lightning, the yard dropped under me, and instinctively I clung with both hands to the tie, then I came to myself with a rush, and felt something like a choking hand at my throat. For an instant I thought the Gulf Stream in my head was whirling me away to eternity, but the next moment I found myself standing. The yard had descended to the cup, and shaking myself in my jacket, I felt that I was unharmed and alive. Who had done this? Who had made this attempt on my life? Thought I, as I ran down the rigging. Here it comes! Lord, Lord, here it comes! See, see! It is white as a hammock. Who's coming? I shouted, springing down into the top. Who's white as a hammock? Bless my soul, Bill, it's only White Jacket, that infernal White Jacket again. It seems they had spied a moving white spot there aloft, and, sailor-like, had taken me for the ghost of the Cooper. And after hailing me and bidding me descend to test my corporeality, and getting no answer, they had lowered the halyards in a fright. In a rage I tore off the jacket and threw it on the deck. "Jacket," cried I, "you must change your complexion. You must hie to the dyers and be dyed, that I may live. I have but one poor life, White Jacket, and that life I cannot spare. I cannot consent to die for you, but be dyed you must for me. You can die many times without injury, but I cannot die without irreparable loss and running the eternal risk." So, in the morning, jacket in hand, I repaired to the first lieutenant, and related the narrow escape I had had during the night. I enlarged upon the general perils I ran in being taken for a ghost, and earnestly besought him to relax his commands for once, and give me an order on Brush, the captain of the paint-room, for some black paint, that my jacket might be painted of that color. "Just look at it, sir," I added, holding it lip. "Did you ever see anything whiter? Consider how it shines of a night, like a bit of the Milky Way. A little paint, sir, you cannot refuse." "The ship has no paint to spare," he said. You must get along without it. Sir, every rain gives me a soaking. Cape Horn is at hand. 6 brushes full would make it waterproof, and no longer would I be in peril of my life. Can't help it, sir. Depart. I fear it will not be well with me in the end. For if my own sins are to be forgiven only as I forgive that hard-hearted and unimpressible first lieutenant, then pardon there is none for me. What, when but one dab of paint would make a man of a ghost, and it mackintosh of a herring net, to refuse it I am full. I can say no more. End of chapter 19. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 20 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 20. How They Sleep in a Man of War. No more of my luckless jacket for a while. Let me speak of my hammock, and the tribulations I endured therefrom. Give me plenty of room to swing it in. Let me swing it between 2 date trees on an Arabian plain, or extend it diagonally from Moorish pillar to pillar in the open marble court of the lions in Granada's Alhambra. Let me swing it on a high bluff of the Mississippi, 1 swing in the pure ether for every swing over the green grass. Or let me oscillate in it beneath the cool dome of St. Peter's, or drop me in it as in a balloon from the zenith, with the whole firmament to rock and expatiate in. And I would not exchange my coarse canvas hammock for the grand state bed, like a stately coach and 4, in which they tuck in a king when he passes a night at Blenheim Castle. When you have the requisite room, you always have spreaders in your hammock, that is, 2 horizontal sticks, 1 at each end, which serve to keep the sides apart and create a wide vacancy between, wherein you can turn over and over, lay on this side or that, on your back if you please, stretch out your legs, in short, take your ease in your hammock. For of all inns, your bed is the best. But when, with 500 other hammocks, yours is crowded and jammed on all sides on a frigate berth deck, the 3rd from above, when spreaders are prohibited by an express edict from the captain's cabin, and every man about you is jealously watchful of the rights and privileges of his own proper hammock, as settled by law and usage, then your hammock is your Bastille and canvas jug, into which, or out of which, it is very hard to get, and where sleep is but a mockery and a name. 18 inches a man is all they allow you, 18 inches in width. In that you must swing. Dreadful! They give you more swing than that at the gallows. During warm nights in the tropics, your hammock is as a stew pan, where you stew and stew till you can almost hear yourself hiss. Vain are all stratagems to widen your accommodations. Let them catch you insinuating your boots or other articles in the head of your hammock by way of a spreader. Near and far, the whole rank and file of the row to which you belong feel the encroachment in an instant, and are clamorous till the guilty one is found out, and his palate brought back to its bearings. In platoons and squadrons they all lie on a level, their hammock clews crossing and recrossing in all directions, so as to present one vast field bed midway between the ceiling and the floor, which are about 5 feet asunder. One extremely warm night, during a calm, when it was so hot that only a skeleton could keep cool, from the free current of air through its bones. After being drenched in my own perspiration, I managed to wedge myself out of my hammock, and with what little strength I had left, lowered myself gently to the deck. Let me see now, thought I, whether my ingenuity cannot devise some method whereby I can have room to breathe and sleep at the same time. I have it. I will lower my hammock underneath all these others, and then, upon that separate and independent level at least, I shall have the whole berth-deck to myself. Accordingly, I lowered away my pallet to the desired point, about 3 inches from the floor, and crawled into it again. But alas, this arrangement made such a sweeping semicircle of my hammock, that, while my head and feet were at par, the small of my back was settling down indefinitely. I felt as if some gigantic archer had hold of me for a bow. But there was another plan left. I triced up my hammock with all my strength, so as to bring it wholly above the tiers of pallets around me. This done, by a last effort, I hoisted myself into it. But alas, it was much worse than before. My luckless hammock was stiff and straight as a board, and there I was, laid out in it, with my nose against the ceiling, like a dead man's against the lid of his coffin. So at last I was fain to return to my old level, and moralize upon the folly, in all arbitrary governments, of striving to get either below or above those whom legislation has placed upon an equality with yourself. Speaking of hammocks, recalls a circumstance that happened one night in the Neversink. It was 3 or 4 times repeated with various but not fatal results. The watch below was fast asleep on the berth-deck, where perfect silence was reigning, when a sudden shock and a groan roused up all hands, and the hem of a pair of white trousers vanished up one of the ladders at the fore hatchway. We ran toward the groan, and found a man lying on the deck, one end of his hammock having given way, pitching his head close to 3 24-pound cannon shot, which must have been purposely placed in that position. When it was discovered that this man had long been suspected of being an informer among the crew, little surprise and less pleasure were evinced at his narrow escape. End of Chapter 20. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 21 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 21. One reason why men of war's men are, generally, short-lived. I cannot quit this matter of the hammocks without making mention of a grievance among the sailors that ought to be redressed. In a man of war at sea, the sailors have watch and watch. That is, through every 24 hours, they are on and off duty every 4 hours. Now, the hammocks are piped down from the nettings, the open space for stowing them, running round the top of the bulwarks, a little after sunset, and piped up again when the forenoon watch is called at 8 o'clock in the morning, so that during the daytime they are inaccessible as pallets. This would be all well enough did the sailors have a complete night's rest, but every other night at sea, one watch have only 4 hours in their hammocks. Indeed, deducting the time allowed for the other watch to turn out, for yourself to arrange your hammock, get into it, and fairly get asleep, it may be said that every other night you have but 3 hours' sleep in your hammock. Having then been on deck for twice 4 hours, at 8 o'clock in the morning your watch below comes round, and you are not liable to duty until noon. Under like circumstances, a merchant seaman goes to his bunk, and has the benefit of a good long sleep. But in a man of war you can do no such thing. Your hammock is very neatly stowed in the nettings, and there it must remain till nightfall. But perhaps there is a corner for you somewhere along the batteries on the gun deck, where you may enjoy a snug nap. But as no one is allowed to recline on the larboard side of the gun deck, which is reserved as a corridor for the officers when they go forward to their smoking room at the bridle port, the starboard side only is left to the seamen. But most of this side also is occupied by the carpenters, sailmakers, barbers, and coopers. In short, so few are the corners where you can snatch a nap during daytime in a frigate, that not 1 in 10 of the watch, who have been on deck 8 hours, can get a wink of sleep till the following night. Repeatedly, after by good fortune securing a corner, I have been roused from it by some functionary commissioned to keep it clear. Off Cape Horn, what before had been very uncomfortable became a serious hardship. Drenched through and through by the spray of the sea at night, I have sometimes slept standing on the spar deck, and shuddered as I slept, for the want of sufficient sleep in my hammock. During 3 days of the stormiest weather, we were given the privilege of the berth deck, at other times strictly interdicted, where we were permitted to spread our jackets and take a nap in the morning after the 8 hours' night exposure. But this privilege was but a beggarly one, indeed. Not to speak of our jackets, used for blankets, being soaking wet, the spray, coming down the hatchways, kept the planks of the berth deck itself constantly wet, whereas, had we been permitted our hammocks, we might have swung dry over all this deluge. But we endeavored to make ourselves as warm and comfortable as possible, chiefly by close stowing, so as to generate a little steam, in the absence of any fireside warmth. You have seen, perhaps, the way in which they box up subjects intended to illustrate the winter lectures of a professor of surgery. Just so we laid, heel and point, face to back, dovetailed into each other at every ham and knee. The wet of our jackets, thus densely packed, would soon begin to distill. But it was like pouring hot water on you to keep you from freezing. It was like being packed between the soaked sheets in a water-cure establishment. Such a posture could not be preserved for any considerable period without shifting side for side. 3 or 4 times during the 4 hours I would be startled from a wet doze by the hoarse cry of a fellow who did the duty of a corporal at the after end of my file. "Sleepers ahoy! Stand by to slew round!" And with a double shuffle we all rolled in concert, and found ourselves facing the taffrail instead of the bowsprit. But, however you turned, your nose was sure to stick to one or other of the steaming backs on your 2 flanks. There was some little relief in the change of odor consequent upon this. But what is the reason that, after battling out 8 stormy hours on deck at night, men-of-war's men are not allowed the poor boon of a dry 4 hours' nap during the day following? What is the reason? The Commodore, Captain, and First Lieutenant, Chaplain, Purser, and scores of others have all night in, just as if they were staying at a hotel on shore. And the junior lieutenants not only have their cots to go to at any time, but as only one of them is required to head the watch, and there are so many of them among whom to divide that duty, they are only on deck 4 hours to 12 hours below. In some eases the proportion is still greater. Whereas with the people, it is 4 hours in and 4 hours off continually. What is the reason, then, that the common seamen should fare so hard in this matter? It would seem but a simple thing to let them get down their hammocks during the day for a nap. But no, such a proceeding would mar the uniformity of daily events in a man of war. It seems indispensable to the picturesque effect of the spar deck that the hammocks should invariably remain stowed in the nettings between sunrise and sundown. But the chief reason is this, a reason which has sanctioned many an abuse in this world. Precedents are against it. Such a thing as sailors sleeping in their hammocks in the daytime, after being 8 hours exposed to a night storm, was hardly ever heard of in the Navy. Though, to the immortal honor of some captains be it said, the fact is upon Navy record that off Cape Horn they have vouchsafed the morning hammocks to their crew. Heaven bless such tender-hearted officers, and may they and their descendants, ashore or afloat, have sweet and pleasant slumbers while they live, and an undreaming siesta when they die. It is concerning such things as the subject of this chapter that special enactments of Congress are demanded. Health and comfort, so far as duly attainable under the circumstances, should be legally guaranteed to the man-of-war's men, and not left to the discretion or caprice of their commanders. End of chapter 21. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista.